423. Political action. It was legislation, said the arbiter union, that had created the unjust monetary system which turns the product of labor over to capital. How but through political action could a just monetary system that will fairly distribute the products of labor be established? 32 confirmed currency reformers. Many leaders of the National Labor Union now concentrated more and more of their energies on political action, ignoring at the same time all issues which could not be affected by such action. Their mistake was not that they took up political issues but that they picked the wrong issue and ignored the economic struggles of the workers. The attitude of the trade unions toward political action during and immediately after the Civil War was not consistent. Some unions forbade their membership, under any pretense whatever, to introduce or discuss political questions, and justified this ban with the argument that dissension over the support of candidates at elections would split the unions. Point 33. But this did not mean that trade unionists should remain aloof from politics. Political activity by the workers was necessary, but it had to be conducted outside the union. Point 34. Many trade unions recognized the limitations of such an approach, and political as well as economic issues were raised at all meetings. The carpenters and joiners, the coopers, the plasterers, the cigar makers and the miners' unions were but a few of the labor organizations whose conventions featured discussions of the need for political action. At the convention of the State Union of Carpenters and Joiners of Massachusetts in January 1866, such discussion was followed by the adoption of a series. 424. Labor movement in the United States. Of resolutions calling for greater political activity by the organized workers of the Bay State. Resolved, went the concluding resolution, that we declare that we will demand, maintain, and defend our rights, not only in the workshop and the dusty field of toil, but also in the halls of the state legislature, in the courts of law, and in the Congress of the United States. 35. Because the nature of their industry demanded legislative intervention, and because of their experience in England with the movement to secure such legislation, the miners of Pennsylvania were among the most politically minded and alert workingmen in the country. Founded by John Siney in 1868, the Miners and Laborers Benevolent Association, formerly the Workingmen's Benevolent Association of Schuylkill County, soon became an effective collective bargaining force, securing a trade agreement with the coal operators in 1869 and 1870. Through its political activities, the union secured the passage of a law by the state legislature in 1869 legalizing trade unions. The law stated that it was lawful for any and all classes of mechanics, journeymen, tradesmen, and laborers to form societies and associations for their mutual aid, benefit, and protection, and peaceably to meet, discuss, and establish all necessary rules and regulations to carry out the same all acts or parts of acts inconsistent herewith are hereby repealed. 36. Since the law did not free workers or their unions from liability to prosecution for conspiracy, the Workingmen's Benevolent Association fought for a new law to exempt workingmen and their unions from the conspiracy laws. This was achieved in 1872 when a law was passed by the state legislature to relieve workmen, laborers, and journeymen from certain prosecutions and indictments for conspiracy under the civil laws of the Commonwealth. The first mine inspection bill was passed by the legislature in April 1869, after a vigorous campaign in which the Union brought the issues to the people of the state. This act provided for the better regulation and ventilation of mines, and for the protection of the lives of the miners in the county of Schuylkill, and authorized the governor to appoint an inspector of mines. The miners fought for a law covering the entire anthracite region, but the legislature listened to the mine owners who claimed that the mines in the other counties did not require ventilation or inspection. A few months later, the Avondale, Luzerne County, disaster in which 109 miners lost their lives, aroused public opinion to demand a more effective mine inspection law which would apply to all the anthracite mines in the state. When the legislature convened, delegates from the miners' union went to Harrisburg and stayed there until a new law was passed. Point 3. Not all trade unions were as active politically as the miners' union, but the 8-hour question, the importation of Chinese labor, and the labor movement, 1866 to 1872 use of the conspiracy doctrine to attack labor organization were compelling reasons for trade unions to consider political action. When neither of the major parties showed any interest in measures demanded by the workingmen, the trade unions in many states took the lead in forming independent political parties. In California, the trade unions formed the base of a third-party movement organized to meet the threat of Chinese labor, and in Massachusetts the Knights of St. Crispin, anxious to secure legal recognition by incorporation, helped to start and gave full support to the State Labor Reform Party. Point 38. In 186G, the Massachusetts Labor Reform Party won an amazing victory. With an organization formed 3 weeks before Election Day and without funds or newspaper support, the party elected one of its candidates to the state Senate and 22 to the lower house, polling 13,000 votes in the state. Overnight, the party became an important factor in American politics. The Republican Party, in self-defense, reproached the working men, saying that it had accomplished more for the elevation of the laborers of America than had been accomplished before since the government was framed. Hence it viewed with surprise and indignation the claim of any other organization to arrogate to itself the title of Labor Party. 39. Undaunted by the peak of the Republican Party, the workingmen of Massachusetts prepared to enter the gubernatorial campaign of 1870. It selected as its candidate for governor that great American, Wendell Phillips. Unlike many of the abolitionists, Phillips had always regarded the abolition of slavery as but one aspect of the emancipation of mankind, and when slavery was abolished, he devoted much of his time to labor reform. As early as November 2, 1865, Phillips delivered an address at Faneuil Hall in Boston in favor of the 8-hour day, in which he said, "It is 29 years this month since I first stood on the platform of Faneuil Hall to address the citizens of Boston. I felt then that I was speaking for the cause of the laboring man, and if tonight I should make the last speech of my life, I would be glad that it should be in the same strain, for laboring men and their rights." 40. Phillips conducted an active campaign, but the combined votes of the Labor Reform and the Prohibition Party were 21,946, as against 79,549 for the Republicans, and 49,536 for the Democrats. One reason for the defeat was the lack of organization which even Phillips' eloquence could not overcome. Like most labor parties of this period, there was little political activity between elections, and at election time there was no local organization to get out the vote. The state convention of the Massachusetts Labor Reform Party was held at Worcester on September 4, 1871. 425. Labor movement in the United States. 426. Delegates were present, including about 10 women. Phillips welcomed the delegates and made the keynote speech. "Under all flags," he said, "there is one great movement. It is for the people peaceably to take possession of their own. We come by the right of numbers to take possession of the government of the earth." The platform drawn up by Phillips opened with the words, "We affirm as a fundamental principle that labor, the creator of wealth, is entitled to all it creates." In the resolutions, war was declared on the wages system which enslaves the working man, on the present system of finance, which robs labor and gorges capital, on the lavish grants of land to speculating companies, and on the system of enriching capitalists by the creation and increase of the public interest-bearing debt. Demands were raised for the 8-hour day and for the discontinuance of the forced importation of Chinese labor. Another demand read, "Whenever women are employed at public expense to do the same kind and amount of work as men perform, they shall receive the same wages." 41. E. M. Chamberlain, who had headed the state ticket in 1869, was the candidate of the Labor Reform Party for governor. Though Phillips refused to run for public office, he stumped the state once again for the Labor Party. "When we get into power," said he, "there is one thing we mean to do. If a man owns a single house, we will tax him $100. If he owns 10 houses of like value, we won't tax him $1,000, but $60,000, and the richer a man grows, the bigger his tax, so that when he is worth $40 million, he shall not have more than $20,000 a year to live on." 42. The Labor Party received 6,848 votes. Phillips attributed the small vote to intimidation by employers. When speaking at meetings attended by factory workers, he said, none of them dared sit on the platform or introduce him for fear of being reported by spies. There was a good deal of truth to this, but the main reason for the defeat is to be found in the decline of the Knights of St. Crispin and other unions in New England during this period. 43. In 1872, the Massachusetts Labor Reform Party split into two small hostile groups, the Labor Union headed by Phillips, and the 8-Hour League led by Ira Stewart and George McNeil. The split occurred over the 8-hour question. Stewart regarded it as the only question of significance to labor, and he particularly opposed the currency issue. Wendell Phillips, influenced by the writings of Edward Kellogg, was moving more and more toward currency reform. When he insisted that the platform of the Labor Party lead off with a demand, the labor movement, 1866 to 1872, for a new monetary system, the 8-hour advocates walked out and set up their own organization. 44. This conflict between the currency reformers and the 8-hour advocates seriously weakened various state efforts at independent political action. Each group believed that its program alone would emancipate the working class. But the workers were losing interest in labor parties headed by men concerned primarily with advancing their pet theories. 45. The rapid decline of the state labor parties does not mean that they had accomplished nothing. The very fact that labor was acting independently forced the existing parties to be more attentive to the demands of the workingmen, and some significant gains for labor were won. The formation of the Massachusetts Bureau of Labor Statistics in 1869 is an example. The Working Man's Advocate of August 5, 1871, stated that this victory alone justified the formation of a Labor Party. In Massachusetts, for the Bureau had done more to advance the principles of labor reform than could have been accomplished in years by the usual methods of agitation. The facts were before the people. They knew the depths not only of their own but their neighbors' degradation under the iron heel of monopolized capital. At the 1867 convention of the National Labor Union, a resolution was adopted which read, "The time has arrived when the industrious classes should cut themselves aloof from party ties and predilections and organize into a national labor party." 46 a year later, at the 1868 convention, a committee was appointed to formulate a platform for the proposed National Labor Party. Bowing to the insistence of those delegates who opposed independent political action, the convention agreed that the new party would not participate in the forthcoming presidential campaign. However, the Declaration of Principles, modeled after the Declaration of Independence, was made public. Nearly two-thirds of the document dealt with currency reform. In addition to advocating that the national banking system be abolished and that the rate of interest be fixed by the government, it demanded land grants to actual settlers. Only, a Department of Labor, an honest and intelligent expression of Congress on the 8-hour question, a liberal system of railroads, express, water transportation, and telegraph communications, under the management of the general government for the benefit of the people. We earnestly ask. The platform concluded, the cooperation of the whole people, white and black, male and female, to unite and assist in bringing into operation the principles above set forth. 47 The first organizational step was taken at the 1870 Congress, when, despite the opposition of several delegates, an executive committee for the National Labor Reform Party was selected and authorized to decide upon a date for the calling of a nominating convention. The Labor Movement in the United States. 428. Committee, consisting of delegates from 14 states and headed by Cummings of the Knights of St. Crispin, met in Washington early in 1871, and recommended that the convention be held the following October. Later it was decided to postpone the meeting until February 22, 1872. One result of the delay was a split within the executive committee, one group calling a conference in December 1871, and announcing a national convention to be held on July 4, 1872, to nominate candidates for the National Reform Party. This group was not recognized by the National Labor Union, and President Trevelyan announced that it had no authority to act separately. 48 About 100 delegates, representing 14 states, attended the nominating convention held February 22, 1872, in Columbus, Ohio. Most of the delegates had never attended a convention of the National Labor Union, and only about 25 of them were connected with organized labor. One of these 25 was John Siney, leader of the organized miners in the anthracite districts of Pennsylvania. The currency reformers dominated the convention, making the greenback program the major demand of the new party. Other resolutions called for the 8-hour day, the granting of public lands to settlers only, an end to the immigration of forced Chinese labor, and the reduction of the tariff, so as to admit free such articles of common use as we can neither produce nor grow, and laid duties for revenue mainly upon articles of luxury. 49 The main business before the convention was the nominating of candidates. The Republican Party had split, one wing calling itself the Liberal Republicans. Politicians anxious to be nominated at the Liberal Republican Party convention to be held in April were interested in the proceedings at Columbus, for they knew that if they could come to the Liberal Republican convention with the support of a section of labor, their chances for victory would be greater. There was considerable behind-the-scenes manipulation at Columbus by representatives of political figures, few of whom had previously displayed much interest in the welfare of labor. When David Davis of Illinois, one such political figure, was nominated as the presidential candidate of the National Labor Reform Party, a controversy developed. Several local workingmen's committees adopted resolutions ignoring the nominations at Columbus, and called for a new convention. Horace Day and Ezra Wood, both active in the National Labor Union, denounced the choice of Davis, and announced their intention of supporting the forthcoming Women's Rights Convention and its candidates for the presidential campaign. 50 Davis had welcomed the unexpected honor of being Labor's candidate, but when the Liberal Republican Convention nominated Horace, the labor movement, 1866 to 1872 Greeley, he lost interest and informed the National Labor Reform Party that he could no longer serve as its standard-bearer. Thereupon a call was issued to all delegates who had attended the Columbus Convention urging them to appear at a conference to be held in New York on July 30. 35 individuals answered the call and joined in the adoption of a resolution asserting that the working classes of the country have nothing to choose between President Grant and Horace Greeley. At a meeting in Philadelphia on August 22 to elect a new candidate, it was voted to send delegates to attend a convention of Democrats who had refused to go along with their party in supporting Horace Greeley. Unprincipled politics led to the choice of Charles O'Connor of New York, a leading defender of slavery and foe of the Negro people, as the candidate of the National Labor Reform Party. O'Connor was also nominated at the Rump Democratic Convention to which the Labor Reform Party had sent delegates. Small wonder that the party received 29,489 votes in the election. 51 Meanwhile, another group which had refused to join the dissident Democrats held its own conference in Columbus. 12 delegates, led by A.C. Cameron, decided that it was inexpedient at this late day to nominate candidates to fill the vacancy caused by the unexpected withdrawal of David Davis and Joel Parker. 52 Decline of the National Labor Union. This fiasco of 1872 ended the brief existence of the National Labor Union. In a letter to Karl Marx in 1870, F.A. Sorg had stated the fundamental reason for the early decline of the Union. The National Labor Union, which had such brilliant prospects in the beginning of its career, was poisoned by greenbackism and is slowly but surely dying. A year later he observed, "The leaders of the National Labor Union have learned nothing and, it is to be feared, will never learn to understand the labor question." 58 Influenced by Lassallean socialists in America, many of the leaders of the National Labor Union had reached the conclusion that the ballot box alone would correct all the evils of which we complain. They overlooked the all-important truth that without trade unions behind it, political action often accomplished nothing for the working class. The experience with the 8-hour laws proved this, if it proved anything at all. It was most regrettable, therefore, that Cameron, Trevelyan, and other leaders of the National Labor Union did not pay close attention to the following letter from Albany, New York, which appeared in the Working Man's Advocate of February 5, 1870. 430. Labor movement in the United States. Since trade unions have flourished, a wonderful change having come over the spirit of reality in our state legislature, we now demand our rights, and so far they dance attendance on us. We get members of that body to present bills we wish passed, and tell them all that if we fail to get justice at their hands, we will place our direct representatives there to grant it at the next session. And we've asked and got the Assembly Chamber to hold a working man's mass meeting. The Honorable Assembly of the Empire State adjourned to let those horrid conspirators, those trade union men, hold a meeting. This dispatch showed the direct relationship existing between trade unions and labor's political influence. But the currency reformers learned nothing from this experience. The rapid decline of the National Labor Union can be observed in the composition of its conventions. At the 1868 Congress, 5 national unions, the typographical, molders, machinists, carpenters, and bricklayers, sent 8 delegates. 15 came from 13 trade assemblies, and 43 local trade unions sent as many delegates. At the convention in I-869, 3 national unions, the molders, printers, carpenters, and joiners, sent delegates, and 6 trades assemblies, 5 state labor bodies, and 53 local unions were represented. 54 After the I-869 convention, the Workingmen's Assembly of New York State announced that it disagreed with the sentiment of the leaders of the National Labor Union that no permanent reform can ever be established through the agency of the trade unions. That same year, the Carpenters and Joiners National Union joined in criticizing the leaders of the National Labor Union for their negative attitude toward trade union action, and voted to send no more delegates to the Labor Congress. 65 During 1870-71, all trade unions severed relations with the National Labor Union. 3 national unions, the molders, shoemakers, and printers, sent delegates to the 1870 Congress, and 34 local trade unions and 8 trades assemblies were also represented. Few of these organizations were represented again. The delegates from the National Typographical Union reported that they failed to discover anything in the proceedings that entitled the Congress to representatives from a purely trade organization. 56 William Jessup reported to the Workingmen's Assembly of New York that the National Labor Union had lost sight of its original objectives. He compared the 1870 convention with that of 1866, stating that at the first Congress, every delegate represented some branch of mechanical pursuit. At the last convention we find a strange mixture of mechanics, working. The labor movement, 1866 to 1872. 431 men, ministers, lawyers, editors, lobbyists, and others of no particular occupation, some intent upon organizing a political labor party, others using their efforts to defeat that measure and benefit existing parties. With so much difference in the aims of the representatives, the convention could be none other than it was unharmonious. 57. In 1871, the Bricklayers and the Cigar Makers National Union severed relations with the National Labor Union. The cigar makers said that it was inexpedient hereafter to have any more connection with the Labor Congress, for the reason of it being an entirely political institution, and no benefits deriving therefrom. 58 At the 1871 convention there were only 2 delegates who could be said to represent a labor organization, the Iron Molders Local Union of Ottawa, Illinois, and the Mechanics State Council of California. The majority of the 22 delegates were agrarian reformers. The 7 delegates who attended the 1872 Congress decided to form a new association. whose primary object shall be to discuss questions of a non-political character. A committee of 3, composed of Trevelyan, Cameron, and M.A. Foran of the Coopers International Union, was designated to open a correspondence with the presidents of the various state, national, and international trade and labor unions, requesting them to take into consideration the expediency of calling a National Industrial Congress. 59. The National Labor Union was a thing of the past. Despite its short life, the National Labor Union was an important stage in the development of the American labor movement. It had crystallized the most significant issues for workers in this period, and through its educational activities had helped to rally labor throughout the nation around these issues. It was among the first organizations in the world to raise the question of equal pay for equal work for women and to place them in positions of leadership. It was the first American National Labor Federation to welcome Negro delegates. The first American labor body to have a strong lobby in Washington, it urged the creation of a Department of Labor. It directed attention to the need for the shorter workday and cooperated to establish the 8-hour system in the federal and state governments. It directed activity to rectify unjust legislation. It fought the unjust grants of land to the railroads, and called for the restoration of the public domain to the people. It was recognized as the representative of American labor by the International Working Men's Association, and sent an official delegate abroad to attend a convention of that body. It assisted in the launching of a number of state labor parties and of the first National Labor Party in the history of the American labor movement. Labor movement in the United States. The program of that party, monetary reform, was disastrous, but the existence of such a party, dominated though it was by a petty bourgeois ideology, proved that an important section of the working class was ready to act independently in national politics. While it overemphasized political action and monetary reform and ignored trade unionism in its last years, the National Labor Union brought to the attention of the American people the fact that the government of the United States was becoming more and more dominated by industrial and financial monopolist interests, and that to preserve American democratic institutions a great people's movement was necessary which would unite workers, farmers, and small producers. Asterisk. Since this book was published in 1947, the most important new work on the period of the Civil War and Reconstruction in relation to organized labor is David Montgomery, Beyond Equality, Labor, and the Radical Republicans, 1862–1872, New York, 1967. Dr. Montgomery discusses in detail the labor reform movement, and concludes that while the Radical Republicans were concerned with the problems of Negro equality, they were less so with the demands of wage earners in the North. That this in turn helped bring on the eclipse of radicalism, and that even though it did not entirely succeed in obtaining its ends, the labor reform movement had by the end of the Civil War decade established itself as a source to be reckoned with in American political and economic life. In general, Dr. Montgomery's discussion is in keeping with that presented in the present volume, but he differs with me on a number of issues. This can be easily traced in the index of Dr. Montgomery's volume under Foner, Philip S. Though the Knights of Labor did not become an important force in the labor movement until after the period under discussion, its beginnings belonged to the era of the National Labor Union. A small group of garment cutters in Philadelphia in 1869 organized a new body called the Noble and Holy Order of the Knights of Labor. The impetus for its organization came out of the failure of the Garment Cutters Association of Philadelphia, which had been organized in 1862. One Uriah Stevens, one of its active members, was convinced that the decline of the union was due to a lack of secrecy. "I am determined," said Stevens, "to make an effort to institute something different. When the dissolution takes place, I shall make an effort to get some good men together and originate something that will be different from what we have ever had." 2. That something different was the first local assembly of the Knights of Labor, whose establishment was an event of immense import in the American labor movement. On December 9, 1869, a resolution was adopted to dissolve the Garment Cutters Association, and immediately after the dissolution, Stevens and 8 other former members became the charter members of the new organization. All took a pledge of secrecy, and a committee was appointed to draw up a secret plan for the government of the new organization. On December 28, the new association adopted the name, the Knights of Labor. On January 6, 1870, officers were elected, Stevens being chosen master workman, the title of the presiding officer, while James L. Wright became the venerable sage, or the retiring presiding officer. Other officers were worthy foreman, the unknown knight, recording secretary, financial secretary, and treasurer. The initiation fee was set at $1. 3. 433. 434. Labor movement in the United States. Rituals of the Knights of Labor. Many of the trade unions of this period had elaborate titles for their officers and high-sounding ceremonies, but none of them carried this practice as far as did the Knights of Labor. When a candidate and until 1878 only wage earners could become members was invited to join the Knights, he attended a secret meeting where he was first asked 3 questions. Do you believe in God, the Creator and Father of all? Do you obey the universal ordinance of God, in gaining your bread by the sweat of your brow? Are you willing to take a solemn vow, binding you to secrecy, obedience, and mutual assistance? If the applicant said yes, he was asked to take a pledge to obey all laws, regulations of the order, and promise to defend the life, interest, reputation, and family of all true members of this order, help and assist all employed and unemployed, unfortunate or distressed brothers to procure employment, secure just remuneration, relieve their distress, and counsel others to aid them, so that they and theirs may receive and enjoy the just fruits of their labor and exercise of their art. After the pledge, the new member was taken to the base of the sanctuary, the meeting room, to receive instructions of the worthy foreman. Here he was told that the organization of labor was made necessary by the fact that in every trade, capital had its combinations and, whether intended or not, they crushed the manly hopes of labor and trample poor humanity in the dust. The Knights meant no conflict with legitimate enterprise, no antagonism to capital. But they were aware that men, blinded by self-interests, overlook the rights of others, and sometimes even violate the rights of those they deem helpless. To prevent such violation, the Knights intended to create a healthy public opinion on the subject of labor, the only creator of values, and the justice of its receiving a full, just share of the values or capital it has created. They would support all laws which sought to harmonize the interests of labor and capital, and also those laws which tend to lighten the exhaustiveness of toil. They did not approve of general strikes, but if it should become justly necessary to enjoin an oppressor, we will protect and aid any of our members who thereby may suffer loss, and as opportunity offers, extend a helping hand to all branches of honorable toil. 4. When the candidate had been told the objectives of the Knights of Labor, he was turned over to the venerable sage who explained the secret organization of the order, such as the grips, the passwords, and how to know when an assembly would meet. The last bit of informa tie-in was very important, for until 1878 or 1879 the name of the order was never referred to as such. It was known as the 5 Stars, or as Birth of the Knights of Labor. 435 the 5 asterisks, since it was represented in printed documents by 5 asterisks thus dash asterisk 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 asterisk. Calls for meetings were often chalked upon sidewalks and fences in mysterious symbols which were clear only to the initiated. The symbol 8 meant local assembly number 8000 would meet on August 1st, at 8 o'clock. 5. Role of Uriah S. Stevens. To understand the meaning of the initiation ceremonies, it is necessary to know something about Uriah S. Stevens. The /Ornal of United Uber, the official organ of the order, in its obituary of Stevens on February 15, 1882, declared, "All through our rituals and laws will be found the impress of his brain, an inspiration of his keen insight into the great problems of the present hour." Stevens was born in 1821 at Cape May, New Jersey, and was trained for the Baptist ministry. During the Panic of 1837, he was forced to abandon his studies, and became apprenticed to a tailor. Later, he taught school in New Jersey and, in 1845, moved to Philadelphia where he became a tailor. A vigorous opponent of slavery and the Slavocracy, he joined the Republican Party immediately after its formation and campaigned for Fremont and Lincoln. 8 Stevens' activities during the early 60s are not too well known. One story has it that he went to Europe where he came in contact with prominent Marxists, and it has been recorded that he brought back from Europe when he returned to America a copy of the Communist Manifesto by Marx and Engels. Stevens is said to have told a contemporary that he found that the pamphlet contained pretty much everything I had thought out myself, and I used it largely in the preparation of the Declaration of Principles of the Order. 7. This story is questioned by Professor Norman J. Ware, historian of the Knights of Labor, who doubts that Stevens ever traveled to Europe or received copies of Marx's writings. Certainly there is little in Stevens' philosophy of labor that has anything in common with Marxism, and he himself was opposed to the policies of Sorg and other American Marxists, and was against having anything to do with them either individually or as a body. 8. Stevens put great emphasis on the word solidarity. Labor, he argued, had to be powerful and unified to cope with the strength of organized capital. The only organization of labor which would meet the power of capital was one which united workers of all trades, and was universal in its scope. Trade unions, he believed, were too narrow, both in composition and in their fields of operation. Instead of uniting labor movement in the United States, all workers, they barred the unskilled, the Negroes, and other groups of workers. Since all workers, Stevens maintained, had common interests, They should logically belong to a common society and be united by their bonds of universal brotherhood. 9. This unity could be won through 3 principles: secrecy, cooperation, and education. Secrecy had a triple purpose. It would protect the worker from anti-labor employers. It would prevent employers from discovering the plans of the workers. And finally, secret rituals would bring home to the new member the importance of the organization he had just joined. In the secret sanctuary of the meeting room, all craft, religious, national, racial, and political differences disappeared. Here the wage earner could think and act as a wage earner, and not as a white or Negro, American, European, or Asiatic, Democrat or Republican, Catholic, Protestant or Jew. Creed, party, and nationality, Stevens once said, are but the outward garments and present no obstacle to the fusion of the hearts of worshippers of God, the universal Father, and the workers for man, the universal brother. 10. Stevens did not confine his attention to improvements within the wage system. He believed that a major objective of the Knights was to achieve the complete emancipation of the wealth producers from the thraldom and loss of wage slavery. 11. Through cooperation, the Knights would achieve better conditions, and the gradual substitution of the cooperative system for capitalism. Improvement of working conditions would come through trade assemblies based on craft union organization, and the replacement of the capitalist system by the cooperative system was the task of the mixed assemblies that united workers regardless of craft. 12. Education, Stevens believed, would play a large part in achieving the immediate and ultimate objects of the Knights of Labor by breaking down the prejudices and antagonisms which still divided the working class. Within the secret sanctuary of the Knights of Labor, members were taught that workers, regardless of their different occupations, had common aims and interests. Education would also prepare the members to act politically, because only when the membership understood the principles of political economy and politics could they be effective in the life of the nation. Stevens' emphasis on education is reflected in an interesting procedure adopted by the early Knights. When a member entered the vestibule or anteroom of the meeting room, he came upon a small, triangular table on which a basket full of cards was placed. To obtain admission to the sanctuary or meeting room, the member had to write his name on a card. The aim was to compel each member to learn to read and write, and Terence V. Powderly, later the outstanding leader of the Knights, observed that he knew of over 100 men in Scranton who were influenced by this card system to take a course in writing so that they could. Birth of the Knights of Labor. Political economy, said Stevens, may and should be freely and exhaustively discussed in the local assembly. In this way, and in this alone, can members become thoroughly informed as to their rights as citizens, both in the abstract or higher laws of God, and legally, or in the present laws of the land. In this way the justice or injustice of their surroundings are made more apparent, and they are enabled more intelligently to discharge the duties of citizenship, exercise the elective franchise, and realize exactly where they stand, and where they consistently belong. 13. Stevens' aim was to unite all workers in a general mass organization regardless of sex, race, creed, or color. I do not claim any power of prophecy, he is reported to have said, but I can see ahead of me an organization that will cover the globe. It will include men and women of every craft, creed, and color. It will cover every race worth saving. 14. In stressing the need for unity and solidarity in the ranks of labor, Stevens was obviously far in advance of many labor leaders of the period who spoke and fought only for the interests of their particular craft. Again, in emphasizing the importance of education and discussions of current political and economic issues, he was far ahead of those trade union leaders who urged that only questions of wages, hours, and working conditions concern the membership of labor organizations. Yet Stevens was more a humanitarian than a trade unionist. The organization he wished to build was not a trade union, but a mass fraternal lodge, a working-class Masonic order. And his belief that secrecy, education, and cooperation alone would create labor solidarity and solve the workers' problems stamped him as a visionary dominated by utopian ideas. Early structure of the Knights of Labor. Although Stevens criticized the trade unions of the period because they were too narrow in their lees and too circumscribed in their field of operations. 15. The early local assemblies of the Knights of Labor were local craft bodies. No one but a garment cutter who could prove that he had served a specified time as an apprentice was admitted to local assembly number 1. Women were not eligible for membership, and it was not until 1882 that women were initiated into the order. Compared with the trade unions of that day, writes Terence V. Powderly, the first assembly of the Knights of Labor was far behind them in toleration. Not only write but read their names and other things beside. The Path I Trod, New York, 1940, page 54. Labor movement in the United States. And fellowship. 16. The main emphasis in the early assemblies was on a rigid craft organization. Not until the order expanded into the coal and iron regions of western Pennsylvania did these exclusive craft ideas begin to break down, and only then did the Knights of Labor make substantial progress. To understand this change in the organization of the Knights of Labor, we must turn our attention to the Long Depression of the 70s. The idea of solidarity was expressed in the practice of allowing members of other crafts to join the garment cutters local. These men, known as sojourners, did not participate in discussions of trade matters and did not pay dues, but would become organizers among their own kind of workers to form new assemblies. The first sojourner was admitted in 1870, and the second assembly, organized on July 18, 1872, was set up by ship carpenters and caulkers of Philadelphia who had been sojourners in Local Assembly No. 1. The fact that the second assembly was not formed until 1872 is proof that the order grew very slowly at first. Despite the post-Civil War depression, real wages increased during 1865 to 73 due to the great activity of labor through trade unions and political organizations. The Bureau of Labor Statistics of Pennsylvania stated that the wage increases of organized workers during this period were 40% higher than those of unorganized labor. 1 When, in September 1873, the banking house of J. Cook and Company closed its doors, the situation changed completely. Overnight, the entire credit structure of the country crumbled, and before the end of the year, over 5,000 commercial failures had been reported. Conditions. 2. Declining union membership throughout the following 6 terrible years. Unemployment was on the upgrade. The New York Association for the Improvement of the Condition of the Poor estimated that by the end of 1873, 1/4 of the working force, or about 43,750 persons in New York City, were out of work. Similar agencies in other industrial centers reported the same. In 1877 to 78, 3 million workers were unemployed, and at least 1/5 of the working class was permanently unemployed. 2/5 worked no more than 6 to 7 months in the year, and less than 1/5 was regularly employed. 3 One New York worker asked in the fall of 1877, "What are our carpenters doing? Nothing. What are our bricklayers doing? Nothing. What have they to live on the coming winter? Nothing." Few were the unions that weathered the storm of this long depression. Of the 30 national unions in existence when the crisis broke in 1873, there were only 8 or 9 by 1877. The Machinists' and Blacksmiths' Union lost 2/3 of its members. The Coopers' National Union decreased from 7,000 members in 1872 to 1,500 in 1878. The Cigar Makers' 439. Labor movement in the United States. 440. National Union from 5,818 to 1,016 in 1877, and the Typographical National Union from 9,797 in 1873 to 4,260 in 1878. The Knights of St. Crispin, with a membership of about 50,000, early in 1872, had practically no members in 1878. In New York City, trade union membership decreased from about 45,000 in 1873 to 5,000 in 1878. The total trade union membership of Cincinnati in 1878 was about 1,000, and Cleveland, an important trade union center before the Depression, was a non-union city in 1878. 5 While there are no reliable statistics as to the total trade union membership in the United States on the eve of the Depression, it has been estimated that about 300,000 workers belonged to trade unions early in 1873. In his testimony before the United States Industrial Commission in 1900, Samuel Gompers estimated the total trade union membership in 1878 at 50,000. 6 Lockouts, blacklists, legal prosecutions, and yellow dog contracts were used by employers to smash the trade unions. When a delegation of French trade unionists visited America in 1876 to join the national celebration of the centennial of the Declaration of Independence, they were shocked to discover that, in this great American republic, many workers were afraid to serve on delegations to welcome them, fearing that it would label them as trade union members. A union member, they were told, was hunted like a mad dog. In their report to the trade unions of France, the delegates remarked that this experience had convinced them that capital was as much the master in America as in Europe. 7 Persistence of unionism. Trade unionism, however, was not crushed. The National Trade Association of Hat Finishers of the United States of America not only kept alive but retained a closed shop during the Depression. And the Sons of Vulcan organized 20 new forges in 1874. A year later, the Union won a bitterly fought strike. In 1876, the United Sons of Vulcan, Pudless, the Associated Brotherhood of Iron and Steel Heaters, Rough Heirs, Rollers and Catchers, the Iron and Steel Roll Hands Union, and the United Nailers, united to form the Amalgamated Iron and Steel Workers. 8 In the bituminous or soft coal mining industry, the Depression years saw the formation of the Miners' National Association of America, modeled after the British Union of the same name. All workers employed in and around the mines could become members. Founded in October 1873, the Union grew steadily in spite of the Depression. By May 1874, it had gained about 25,000 members. "Our hope," wrote John Siney, head of the organization, in May 1875, "is that we will." The Long Deples Sion, 1873 to 1878. Continue to grow till all who toil in the mines of the country will be good and efficient members of the Miners' National Association. 9. These successes were the exceptions. In vain did the trade union journals remind the workingmen that in those places where the union flourishes wages are higher than where there are no unions. 10. The refusal of employers to give men work who would not leave the union forced workers out of the labor organizations. 11. Several attempts during the Depression years to form national labor federations ended in failure. The Industrial Congress, founded by a convention of trade union delegates on July 15, 1872, went to pieces 2 years later. Its founders had pledged that the new federation would not engage in independent political action or deteriorate into a political 441 party, or a refuge for played-out politicians. 1. The Congress tried to help the unions engage in strikes, and even sent out organizers into the field, one of whom was Terence V. Powderly, soon to head the Knights of Labor. In 1874, the Industrial Brotherhood, a secret labor federation, fused with the Industrial Congress, contributing to the Congress its ritual, constitution, and name. The preamble to this new organization, called the Industrial Brotherhood, placed great importance on political action, and on the struggle for a national greenback currency issued directly to the people and interchangeable for government bonds bearing not over 3.65% interest. Other demands included equal pay for equal work, the 8-hour day, the abolition of the contract system on public work, laws for the promotion of safety and health measures, monthly wage payments, and wage lien laws. 13. The last meeting of the Industrial Congress was held in 1875, the only national trade union represented being the Typographical Union. Its most important action at this convention was the designating of July 4, 1876, as the day the 8-hour system was to go into effect by a united movement on the part of the working masses of the United States. 14. Following the dissolution of the Industrial Brotherhood, several futile attempts were made to establish a national labor federation. Thus, from 1873 until 1878, when the Knights of Labor became a national factor in the American labor movement, there was no national labor body to lead the unions in meeting the offensives of the employers. 70 delegates attended the convention. 44 came from 5 national unions: Coopers, Machinists, Molders, Sons of Vulcan, and Knights of St. Crispin. Other delegates included representatives of miners, cigar-making typographical, and tobacco workers. 442. Labor movement in the United States. Depression living. It is but necessary for one to make a tour of the city during the hours of 7 to 8 a.m. and 5 to 6 p.m., wrote a New York trade unionist in the Twyla of July, 1874. And observe the various jobs that are in progress and the number of men working in violation of the 8-hour rule. Men cannot afford to walk about long in idleness, and consequently are obliged to accept any term offered. In the building trades, where the 8-hour day and daily wages of $2.50 to $3 had become common before the Depression, a 10-hour day and daily wages of $1.50 to $2.50 were the prevailing standards in October, 1875. By this time, the former powerful bricklayers, stonecutters, carpenters, plasterers, and painters unions of New York had almost ceased to exist. 15. Between 1873 and 1880, wages in the textile industry were reduced 45%. In 1871, the wage of male weavers in Pennsylvania was $2 per 10-hour day, and of females $1.16. By 1878, the rates had been reduced to $1.23 and 99 cents a day, respectively. Railroad workers suffered wage cuts of between 30 and 40% during the period 1873 to 77. The earnings of furniture workers dropped 40 to 60% between 1873 and 1876.16 as early as the summer of 1874. The Coopers Union of New York reported, "The situation is deplorable. There is no standard of wages, each man working for what he can get, and all at low wages." A letter addressed by the Central Committee of the Tradesmen's Union of Philadelphia to fellow workmen in the summer of 1874 declared, "The sufferings of the working classes are daily increasing. They will soon be thrown into the deepest misery and affliction. Soon 1/3 only of the actual number of workingmen will be able to get employment, while the other 2/3, homeless and hungry, will look out in vain for the better times prophesied by a lying press. In the middle of the summer we are en masse thrown out of work. Those who still are employed have to submit to constant reductions of wages, until the price of their labor falls to nothing." 17. It is true that the prices of consumer goods also declined and that real wages, therefore, did not drop as low as money wages. But this was more than counterbalanced by the widespread unemployment. During the first 3 months of 1874, about 90,000 homeless workers, 2/5 of whom were women, were lodgers in New York City's police station houses. They were called revolvers because they were not permitted to spend more than 1 or 2 days a month in any one station house. They slept huddled together in their damp clothes on. 443. The Long Depression, 1873 to 1878. Hard benches, and were turned out hungry at daybreak. This method of providing for workers evicted from their homes was properly called utterly barbarous and heartless by a reporter who visited the station houses. 18 But the well-housed and well-fed condemned the over-generous charity of the city in providing even the hard benches because it might sap the foundation of that independence of character and that reliance on one's own resources. The entire business, said the Nation, was thoroughly communistic. 19 As the crisis deepened, the plight of thousands upon thousands of homeless workers, the tramps of the 70s, grew worse. They lived in shacks and gleaned the garbage heaps for food. A reporter for the San Francisco Mail visited one of the communities of homeless workers on the Pacific coast. He asked an aged worker who was extracting from a pile of ashes food that a humane man would hesitate about throwing to his dog, "Can't you find any work?" The old man looked up and answered, "Work, sir? Do you think if we could find work we would live here and have to fight for our meals with the dogs of the city? All the men here go every day from wharf to wharf and hunt the whole city over for a job at any price. 2 bits would be gladly taken for a day's work, but we can't get anything." Several of the other dumpies drew near, and a tall, fine-looking fellow who had been washing himself in a can of water said, "I have lived on this lot for 3 months, eat and sleep here, and I have never let a day go by that I have not walked mile after mile to get a job. Some weeks I have made $1, and weeks I have not made anything. I have offered to work for 1/2 the price that Chinamen, get in any branch of hard labor. But no use. No one would take me. I don't get drunk. I don't steal, but I have got either to starve or live on such stuff as this." 20. Go west? The working man's advocate explained why the workers could not go west. In the first place, many of them have not the means to take them there, and in the second place they have nothing with which to till the land when they get there. If they could cultivate the soil, without oxen, or horses, or implements of agriculture, or could live on grass, and shrubs, and wild fruit while their first year's crop were growing, going west might be a valid question worth considering. 21 Where, after all, could the worker secure $14 to $16 to pay for initial fees and commissions? Money to cover transportation for 500 or 1,000 miles, the price of draft animals and implements, and sustenance for the first few years until enough food could be grown to feed his family and pay his expenses? Transportation alone for a family of 444. Labor movement in the United States. 5. Professor Fred A. Shannon estimates would be the equivalent of half a year's wages. 22 Some workers did go west during the Depression years. A local of carpet weavers in Philadelphia moved en masse to Leavenworth, Kansas, when they were told that there were jobs in the community. Others who were planning to go west were dissuaded by appeals from trade union leaders in Chicago, Detroit, and St. Louis to the labor press. "Don't come west," they counseled. The western cities were overrun with mechanics and others in want of employment. 23 A worker who had returned from a trip to the west where he had been in search of work wrote to the National Law Tribune of September 7, 1875. 12 months ago, left penniless by misfortune, I started from New York in search of employment. I am a mechanic, and am regarded as competent in my business. During this year I have traversed 17 states and obtained in that time 6 weeks' work. I have faced starvation, been months at a time without a bed, when the thermometer was 30 degrees below zero. Last winter I slept in the woods, and while honestly seeking employment I have been 2 and 3 days without food. When, in God's name, I asked for something to keep body and soul together, I have been repulsed as a tramp and vagabond. Instead of going west, many workers were coming east, and many more left for Europe and South America. In August 1876, an advertisement appeared in the New York Sun calling for 100 stonecutters and masons who would be ready to go to Scotland for 2 years' work with passage paid. So many workers answered the call that the police had to be called to keep order. A year and a half later, in February 1878, the newspapers carried the story that the SS Metropolis had sunk on its way to South America with a boatload of laborers from the United States. 1 hour after the news that the ship had gone down arrived in Philadelphia. The New York Tribune reported, "The office of Messrs. Collins was besieged by hundreds of hunger-bitten, decent men, begging for the places of the drowned laborers." 24 It should not be concluded that workers were not interested in becoming farmers in the West. Of all that, suggestions made by workingmen to the Congressional Committee of 1878 appointed to investigate the depression in labor and business, The one most frequently advanced urged that a loan or subsidy be granted by Congress to enable the unemployed to take up a claim under the Homestead Act and begin farming. 25 No proposal gained greater support from labor than the bill introduced in the House of Representatives in 1878 by Benjamin F. Butler, which would allow a family expressing the desire to undertake farming in the West to have expended for their benefit the first year. The Long Depression, 1873 to 1878, of settlement a sum not exceeding $1,250. In addition to transportation to the public lands. 26 The bill was labeled a communistic proposal and promptly forgotten. Even the New York Tribune was forced to admit that it was up to Congress to provide for the homeless and the starving. It is useless to ignore this miserable, gaunt fact which stares us in the face at every corner. It said on February 7, 1878, "It is not to be dispelled any longer by soup houses on the one hand, organized precautions against tramps on the other, how the unemployed mechanics and laborers have got through this." 445. Winter, God only knows. Are they all to sink down permanently into tramps and paupers? The New York World outlined its program for the unemployed. The American laborer must make up his mind henceforth not to be so much better off than the European laborer. Men must be content to work for less wages. In this way the working man will be nearer to that station in life to which it has pleased God to call him. 27 American labor, however, was not convinced that God had decreed that all who work shall starve, and their great unemployed demonstrations were proof of their conviction. Unemployed demonstrations. The rallying force in the struggles of the unemployed were the American sections of the International. Toward the end of October, 1873, the Federal Council of the North American Federation of the International Working Men's Association, which combined all sections of the First International in the United States, issued a manifesto in leaflet form. After explaining the extent of unemployment and suffering of the working class, it proposed the following program. "We submit and recommend to you the following plan of organization, put into effect already successfully by our German fellow workers." Even before the crash in September 1873, the International was active in rallying the unemployed to demand relief. In March 1872, a mass meeting of the unemployed, called together by the New York sections of the International, was held in Tompkins Square. The slogans on the banners of the demonstrators read, "The unemployed demand work of the government, 8 hours our first right," and 8 hours peaceably if we can, forcibly if we move 5t. One of the resolutions adopted by the meeting read, "We hereby demand of the government that a National Labor Bureau be established for the purpose of instituting all the various branches of useful industry, guaranteeing employment to all persons who cannot find it elsewhere, upon equitable principles of time, not exceeding 8 hours per day, and compensation, and that the products be sold to the people at cost." Woodhull and Claflin's Weekly, March 23, 1872. The resolution embodies the basic principle advanced by the advocates of the Full Employment Bill. 446. Labor movement in the United States. The workingmen of 1, 2 or more blocks form a district club. The district clubs combine to form ward committees. The ward committees will form a central body by deputizing 3 delegates from every such ward committee. The United Workingmen thus organized will make the following demands to the respective authorities. 1. Work to be provided for all those willing and able to work, at the usual wages and on the 8 hours plan. 2. An advance of either money or produce, sufficient for 1 week's sustenance, to be made to laborers and their families in actual distress. 3. No ejectment from lodging to be made for non-payment of rent. From December 1st to May 1st, 1874. 28. In the 10th Ward of New York City, the German workers had set up an unemployed council early in November 1873, and proceeded to gather information on the extent of unemployment and the needs of families who were in distress. A little later a mass meeting of German workingmen was held, and a central committee elected to coordinate the activity of all the unemployed of the city. At the same time the trade unions of New York went into action. A meeting of trade union representatives took place on November 15, 1873, to demand the employment of mechanics and laborers on public works. A resolution was adopted calling upon the city of New York to request a loan of $10 million from the national government to help out labor. And a petition was forwarded to Congress which asserted that all penniless, homeless and involuntary idle people are the wards of the nation and should not be suffered to roam through the streets neglected and uncared for. It further recommended that the government operate all industry in which it has jurisdiction, and that it employ all members of the working class. All profits of these businesses were to be applied to the reduction of taxes. 29. A meeting at Cooper Institute on December 11, 1873, called by the trade unions and sections of the International in New York, was crowded to the doors and an overflow audience waited outside to hear its decisions. Inside the hall banners proclaimed, The unemployed demand work, not charity. When working men begin to think, monopoly begins to tremble. Equal laws and homes for the industrious. The New York Times condemned these slogans as decidedly communistic. So, the meeting approved the following suggestions from the organizing committee. 1. Public approval of all bills before they become law. 2. No individual be allowed to have more than $30,000. 3. 8 hours constitute a working day. In addition, a resolution was unanimously adopted which declared the Long Depression, 1873 to 1878. 447. Whereas we are industrious, law-abiding citizens, who have paid all taxes and given support and allegiance to the government, resolved that we will in this time of need supply ourselves and our families with proper food and shelter, and we will send our bills to the city treasury, to be liquidated, until we shall obtain work and pay for our work. Before adjourning, the meeting elected a committee of safety in which the international and trade unionists were represented. The Central Committee appointed at the German mass meeting and the Committee of Safety agreed to cooperate. 31 Mass meetings of unemployed workers took place in other cities as well, the American sections of the International playing a leading part in most of them. In Chicago, 5,000 workers, at a meeting on December 21, 1873, sponsored by the International and the trade unions, drew up a petition which demanded employment for all those willing and able to work, at the rate of 8 hours a day and a living wage. It called for the extension of food and money to the unemployed through a committee appointed by the workers. On the following day, 20,000 unemployed workers marched through the streets of Chicago to the City Hall. Calling upon the authorities, their representatives demanded bread for the needy, clothing for the naked, and houses for the homeless. Several years before, over $1 million had been contributed to the Relief and Aid Society for the victims of the Great Chicago Fire. About $100,000 remained of the fund, and the delegation requested that it be turned over to assist families who were in need, and that they be represented on the committee which would select the families to receive assistance, because they knew who was hungry. A conference of the mayor of Chicago, a committee of the Common Council, representatives of the workingmen, and the Relief and Aid Society met on December 26, 1873, but the society refused to turn over its funds to the city treasury. Thereupon the committee representing the workingmen called another mass demonstration, and a mass committee marched on the Relief and Aid Society to appeal for relief. At first the society refused to grant this committee an audience, but when 1,000 workers sought admittance to the building they changed their mind. Believing that the workers were ignorant and superstitious, the society ruled that only those who submitted to vaccination would obtain relief. So many workers appeared before the society's doctor that the police had to be called. Finally the society gave up its struggle and announced that during the first week of 1874 it would provide relief for families of unemployed workers. About 9,719 families were 448. Labor movement in the United States provided with some form of subsistence. But the City Council never kept its promise to aid the unemployed. 32 Meanwhile in New York City the Joint Committee formed by the Central Committee and the Committee of Safety representing trade unions and sections of the International was organizing the unemployed, calling mass meetings and demonstrations. This activity was to culminate in a demonstration of the unemployed on January 13, 1874. Originally it was planned to terminate the parade in front of City Hall, but when this was forbidden, Tompkins Square was chosen. By the time the first marchers entered the square, New Yorkers were witnessing the largest labor demonstration ever held in the city. The mayor, who was expected to address the demonstration, changed his mind and, at the last minute, the police prohibited the meeting. No warning, however, had been given to the workers, and the men, women, and children marched to Tompkins Square expecting to hear Mayor Havmeyer present a program for the relief of the unemployed. When the demonstrators had filled the square, they were attacked by the police. Police clubs, went one account, rose and fell. Women and children ran screaming in all directions. Many of them were trampled underfoot in the stampede for the gates. In the street, bystanders were ridden down and mercilessly clubbed by mounted officers. Hundreds of workers were seriously injured, and several were arrested and sentenced to prison for attacking the police. 33 The Committee of Safety called mass demonstrations to protest police brutality, and to release Christian Moyer, who had been imprisoned on the charge of attacking the police at Tompkins Square. But the unemployed movement could not withstand this severe trial, and it began to lose its momentum. In a number of wards, representatives of Tammany Hall took over leadership of the movement in order to stifle any attempt at mass action, and soon its influence made itself felt in the Committee of Safety. By the fall of 1874, the endless squabbles within the Committee of Safety resulted in the unemployed losing interest. 34. Lassalleans and Marxists. Had the American sections of the International been united, they might have prevented the disintegration of the unemployed movement, but the American socialist movement was anything but a unified body. During the Depression years, the conflict between the Lassalleans and the Marxists in America broke out again, intensified by the migration to the United States of several thousand German workers who had fled the reaction in Germany following the Franco-Prussian War. The 449. The Long Depression, 1873 to 1878. Moment they arrived in America, the ideological conflict that had divided the working class in Germany was transplanted to this country. The conflict manifested itself in the strategy to be followed in organizing the working class for its emancipation. To the Lassalleans, the disintegration of the trade unions was proof that only political action would serve the working class during the Depression. Unemployment demonstrations, they also argued, were of no value unless they led to the formation of a labor party, and once this was accomplished there was little need for any further concentration on mass meetings and demonstrations of the unemployed. 35 The Marxists did not reject political action. They believed that every class struggle was a political struggle. But they held that the time was not yet ripe for the formation of a workers' party strong enough to influence the elections. The trade unions, they contended, were the cradle of the labor movement, and it was the duty of the American sections of the International both to revive existing trade unions and to help in the organization of new ones. The demonstrations of the unemployed should be continued regardless of whether or not they led to a labor party, for such demonstrations secured relief for homeless and hungry families, stimulated the workers to think along socialist lines, and presented opportunities to bring home to workers the importance of building trade unions. 86 After 1873, the Lassallean influence found its expression in the organization of the Labor Party of Illinois in the West, and the Social Democratic Party of North America in the East. The Labor Party, established after the unsuccessful mass demonstrations of the unemployed in Chicago in December 1873, had met with empty promises. By February 1874, it was publishing a weekly organ, Verbot, edited by the Lassallean, Karl Klinge. The Verbot placed great stress on the fundamental Lassallean demand state aid to cooperative societies. In keeping with Lassallean principles, it announced that the Labor Party would have nothing to do with trade unionism, since it never led to any lasting betterment for the workingmen in the several trades. 87 The Social Democratic Party of North America, founded in 1874 by the Lassalleans, emphasized in its original platform that workingmen must concentrate their efforts upon political action. But within the movement were a number of Marxists who constantly stressed the importance of combining trade union and political activities. As a result of their influence, the party gradually approached the ideas of the International. 38, while the Lassalleans, both in the West and in the East, were devoting their energies to the formation of labor parties, the sections of the 450 labor movement in the United States. International, which adhered to Marxist principles, were seeking to become part of the American labor movement. They had a measure of success in 1875 when the United Workers of America, an organization of Irish workingmen led by J. P. McDonnell, affiliated to the International. That this affiliation of Irish workingmen to the International did not develop into a major trend in the labor movement was due in no small measure to the shortcomings of many Marxists in America. Too often, as Sorg often said, they simply transferred to America what they had learned in Germany without attempting to understand the differences between the two labor movements. Many of them made no effort to learn English, and confined their activities to German-speaking workers. Some even had a contempt for Native American workers, regarding them as theoretically backward. 39. The Germans, wrote Engels a decade later, have not understood how to use their theory as a lever which could set the American masses in motion. They do not understand the theory themselves for the most part and treat it in a doctrinaire and dogmatic way, as something which has got to be learned off by heart but which will then supply all needs without more ado. To them it is a creed, and not a guide to action, added to which they learn no English on principle. Hence the American masses had to seek out their own way. 40 For a time it seemed that the split between the Lassalleans and the Marxists would be healed. The Labor Party of Illinois and the Social Democratic Party of North America met with complete failure at the ballot box, thereby vindicating the Marxist contention that premature political action before the workers were organized into trade unions was futile. Applying the lessons of this experience, the advocates of trade union action in the Social Democratic Party increased their influence. At a party convention in 1875, a resolution was adopted which asserted that, under the present conditions, the organization of working people into trade unions is indispensable, and that each party member is obliged to become a member of the union of his trade, or to aid in establishing a trade union where none exists. The Socialist, English organ of the Social Democratic Party, hailed the resolution and called for the defense of the trade unions and their principles upon every occasion, in order that the reorganization of society may be speedily accomplished. 41. The Socialist movement unites. Appeals for unity in the socialist movement poured into the labor press during 1875 to 76. The following, which appeared in the National Labor Tribune of September 25, 1875, was typical. 451. The Long Depression, 1873 to 1878. Throughout the United States there exist numerous organized bodies of workingmen who declare the present political and social systems are false, and require to be changed from their very foundation, that the present degrading dependence on the capitalists for the means of livelihood is the cause of the greater part of the intellectual, moral, and economic degradation that afflicts society. That every political movement must be subordinate to the first great social end, viz., the economic emancipation of the working classes. Roughly stated, this is the creed of an immense number of workingmen, and they are the principles held in common by the organized bodies above referred to, but there are minor points on which we differ. To clear up these points of difference, and unite all the various bodies in one grand, invincible organization, has for some time past been the earnest desire of us all, and now it seems that this desire is about to be realized. From all quarters comes a cry for unity. Suggestions have been made to hold a Congress in some convenient place for the purpose of deciding upon a common plan of action, but the time and place of meeting is not yet fixed. Many persons hostile to the cause of labor and notably the editors of the stock-jobbing press have sought to bring this radical labor movement into disrepute by persistently asserting that the movement is French, German, or Russian, but nothing can be further from the truth. Just as well might these venal writers assert that the law of gravitation, because it was discovered by Newton, is therefore an English movement. For all men who know anything about social science know that the emancipation of labor is neither a local nor a national, but a social problem embracing all countries in which modern society exists. We are working men born or naturalized in the United States, therefore such attempts to make aliens of us only show to what depth of villainy our opponents will proceed. Divide and conquer has ever been the cry of the oppressor, and it has been successful through all the ages, but now the working classes are rallying to the voice of common sense. Unity within the socialist movement was formally established in July 1876, when delegates from 19 American sections of the International met in Philadelphia and dissolved the International Working Men's Association. A few days later, a meeting of socialist organizations was. Before dissolving, the delegates adopted the following declaration. Fellow working men, the International Convention at Philadelphia has abolished the General Council of the International Workingmen's Association, and the external bond of the organization exists no more. The International is dead, the bourgeoisie of all countries will exclaim, and with ridicule and joy it will point to the proceedings of this convention as documentary defeat of the labor movement of the world. Let us not be influenced by the cry of our enemies. We have abandoned the organization of the International Labor Movement in the United States. Held at Philadelphia to form a united party. The platform of the new party, called the Working Men's Party of the United States, adopted the trade union policies of the International, but conceded to the Lassalleans' request that a national instead of an international organization be established. We work for the organization of trade unions, the platform stated, upon a national and international basis to ameliorate the condition of the working people. Since political liberty without economic independence was an empty phrase, the party was to direct its energies first to economic issues. Participation in politics was to be delayed until the party was strong enough to exercise a perceptible influence, and even then only in towns or cities where demands of a purely local character were presented which were not in conflict with the party's platform and principles. Point 42. The program of the Unity Congress was a victory for the International. It's led by Sorg, but there were several shortcomings which were to weaken the party's influence. The National Executive Committee, to be located in Chicago, was dominated by the Lassalleans. Furthermore, for reasons arising from the present political situation in Europe, but as a compensation for it we see the principles of the organization recognized and defended by the progressive workingmen of the entire civilized world. Let us give our fellow workers in Europe a little time to strengthen their national affairs, and they will surely be in a position to remove the barriers between themselves and the work. Ingmen of other parts of the world. Comrades, you have embraced the principle of the International with heart and love. You will find means to extend the circle of its adherents even without an organization. You will find new champions who will work for the realization of the aims of our association. The comrades in America promise you that they will faithfully guard and cherish the acquisitions of the International in this country until more favorable condition will again bring together the workingmen of all countries to common struggles, and the cry will resound again louder than ever. Proletarians of all countries, unite! International Arbiter Association, Verhandlungen der Delegiertenkonferenz zu Philadelphia, 15 July 1876, pamphlet, New York, 1876 pages. SF. The Marxists, however, made every effort to maintain unity within the Working Men's Party of the United States, reminding the Lassalleans that factional struggles only weaken the socialist movement. What a spectacle! Appealed Adolphe Douay. For our common bitter enemies to see the two socialist working men's factions fight each other instead of the common enemy. Las/Jores. Dard, Mar, 31, 1877. The Long Depression, 1873 to 1878. Speaking for the Lassalleans, maintained that political action was the most important method of organizing the American workers for their emancipation. We cannot successfully preach trade unionism in these hard times, he argued. Workingmen members of our party find it difficult to pay even their 10 cents a month to keep up the party. How then can they support a trades union, costing 3 times as much as the expense of membership in our party? One form of labor organization in these hard times can exist only at the expense of the other. And if trade unions could really help workers solve their problems, he concluded, what use was there for a working men's party? 43. The Marxists took issue with Maguire. They admitted that the trade unions were not broad enough to include all workers, but insisted that it 453 was the duty of the socialists to broaden them. To the question, why have a workingmen's party if trade unions are successful? They replied, there is every use for our party. It can do the work which the unions cannot at present accomplish. It can agitate and create intelligence on economical questions. It can make war on the errors of the past. It can arouse the people to the necessity for union and action. It can show itself the party of intelligence and wisdom by helping along every labor union, by working and agitating for the thorough advancement of labor which can only be effected in labor organization. It can hurry the masses into their unions, and the latter it can hurry on to centralized action. If we are to hurry the birth of a better future, we must strive for a healthy present. Let us not be foolishly selfish because our party is not the entire labor movement. It is only an advance guard. 44. The English Journal of the Working Men's Party of the United States, that labor standard, understood the role it should play in American life, and in issue after issue, it appealed to trade unionists to remain in their unions, called upon non-unionists to join labor organizations, and urged members of the Working Men's Party to organize their fellow workers. Even after J.P. McDonnell, editor of the paper, had been censored by the Lassallean-dominated National Executive Committee for his emphasis on trade unionism and the space he was giving to trade union activities, he continued to call for the revival of the trade unions. Articles from the pens of Frederick Engels and George Acarius, a member of the International in England, brought home to the readers of the Labor Standard the news of trade union activities and labor struggles in Europe. On and No paper mirrored the great strike struggles that took place in America as effectively as did this Journal of the Working Men's Party of the United States. 4ij. The American workers did not take unemployment and wage cuts passively, but organized militant struggles to protect their interests. In the textile, coal mining, and transportation industries, workers waged great strikes against the offensives of the employers during this chaotic period. Textile strikes. Fall River, which by 1874 had become an important center of New England's textile industry, was the scene of the most militant strikes in that industry. In the fall of that year, wages were reduced 10%, followed a few months later by another cut. After the first cut, the mule spinners revived their union, hired a secretary, and called mass meetings of all spinners, weavers, and cardroom hands. The latter group, most of whom were women, formed their own union, at the same time that the weavers set up the Weavers' Protective Association. Encouraged by promises of support from spinners locals in New Bedford and Lawrence, Massachusetts, the Fall River workers decided to go on strike if the wage cuts were not rescinded. A delegation from the spinners, weavers, and cardroom workers' unions visited the manufacturers and presented the demand for the rescinding of the wage cut. The employers rejected the demand and refused to discuss arbitration of the question on the grounds that arbitration was un-American. 1. When the cardroom women heard of this refusal, they met separately and voted to strike whether the men did so or not. Soon the men joined the strike, and by February 1875, more than 3,000 workers had stopped work. All workers not affected by the walkout were taxed to support those on strike. After a month of struggle, the employers agreed to rescind the cut on April 1st, and the strike was called off. 2. 454. Challenging the Great Debkey. But by the time summer rolled along, the manufacturers were again trying to restore the 10% wage cut. Again the workers called a strike, and by August nearly every mill in the city was closed down, and the walkout had assumed the character of a general strike in the industry. This strike, called the Great Vacation, lasted for 8 weeks and ended in the workers' defeat. When the strike had stretched into its 3rd week, the discouraged workers decided to call it off. But when they discovered that the employers were now demanding more than the IO% cut, they continued to hold out. On September 27, 1875, the strikers marched to the city hall to demand bread for their starving children. They were greeted by 3 companies of militia and a cordon of police who prevented them from presenting their demands. For many years after, September 27th was marked in Fall River by mass meetings to commemorate these textile strikers. Late in October, the workers returned to the mills, accepting the wage cut and signing the Yellow Dog contracts, or ironclad oaths, as they were called at the time. All workers who had addressed public meetings or in any way had helped lead the strike were blacklisted. The defeat wiped out the unions of the weavers and cardroom operatives. The spinners, however, kept their organization alive. They signed the Yellow Dog contracts, but privately declared that they recognized no agreement forced upon them by the hunger of their children. 8. The Long Strike of 1875. The defeat of the textile workers came shortly after an equally crushing defeat suffered by the miners in the Long Strike of 1875. In 1868, the Workingmen's Benevolent Association was formed, with John Siney as its president. By 1869, the union had 30,000 members, about 85% of the workers in anthracite mines. That very year, after a prolonged strike against a wage cut, the mine owners in the anthracite district signed an agreement which recognized the union as the bargaining agency for the miners and provided for a sliding scale of wages based on the prevailing price of coal, a minimum wage regardless of. Before dissolving their organization, the weavers assigned their slender funds to their leaders so that they could move to other communities. In the Lehigh region, the miners were to be paid according to the price of coal. At Elizabethport, New Jersey, and in the New York market, when coal sold at $5 a ton in this market, the miners would receive their minimum pay, and for every dollar coal advanced above that price, they were to be given an increase of 15%. In the Schuylkill region, where coal was shipped to Philadelphia rather than to New York, wages were to be determined by the price of coal at Port Carbon. When coal sold for $3 a ton at Port Carbon, the Schuylkill miners would receive their minimum wage, and for every advance of 25 cents above that price. 456. Labor movement in the United States. The price of coal was also agreed upon. From that time on, up to 1875, the coal operators tried each year to force a wage cut. The agreement signed on July 29, 1870, by the Anthracite Board of Trade and the Workingmen's Benevolent Association, the first written contract ever drawn up between miners and operators in America, worked out disastrously for the miners. The union accepted a proposal that wages should advance or decline 8%-4% for each 25-cent change in the price of coal, with the minimum basis of $2 a ton. The contract also provided for a cut in the base pay of contract miners whose wages were high, ranging from 0% for those with net earnings of $100 to 40% for those earning over $200 a month. A victory, however, was scored by the union in the agreement when the operators agreed not to discharge any man or officer for actions or duties imposed on him by the Workingmen's Benevolent Association. 4. Unquestionably, the union was dazzled by the prospect of wage increases under the new agreement if the price of coal rose. Unfortunately, the price fell rapidly, and, in the very first month following the acceptance of the new contract, the miners saw their wages cut 8%-4%. By December 1870, their wages had been reduced 24%. In subsequent agreements adopted in 1871, 1872, and 1873, the principle that wages should slide downwards as well as upwards in relation to the price of coal was retained, but the union was successful in raising the minimum wage. Thus, although the price of coal dropped during these years, the miners were at least able to maintain a certain minimum wage. The operators, therefore, were determined to smash the union and the principle of a minimum wage. Franklin B. Gowen, renowned labor hater, was the leader of the coal operators. He was president of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad, which, through its subsidiary, the Philadelphia and Reading Coal and Iron Company, had gained control of the largest collieries in the anthracite district. Since the Schuylkill and Mahoning coal fields depended on the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad for an outlet to a market, Gowen was able to dictate a labor policy to the other coal operators. 5. This coal baron was ready to commit any crime to smash the militant Workingmen's Benevolent Association, or, as it was now called, the Miners and Laborers Benevolent Association. He imported contract labor and hired company police and labor spies. At the same time, he posed as the friend of the laboring man, condemning the union as a despotic organization, before which the poor laboring man has to rouch like a whipped. They would secure a 5% increase in wages. See Andrew Roy, A History of the Coal Miners of the United States, Columbus, Ohio, 1907, pages 76-78, and Marvin W. Schlegel. The Workingmen's Benevolent Association, First Union of Anthracite Miners, Pennsylvania History, Volume 10, October, 1943, pages 246 to 47. Challenging the Great Depression. Spaniel before a lash, and dare not say that his soul is his own. The leaders of the Union, he said, were foreign agitators, advocates of the Commune and emissaries of the International. 6 for 3 years Goen prepared his offensive. Not all coal operators were ready to join his drive against the Union, as they knew the stabilizing effect of Union policies on the industry. But it was not long before Goen eliminated this small group from the industry, and in December 1874, the operators started their attack by announcing a 20% wage cut for contract miners, a 5% cut for laborers, demanded that the minimum basis be eliminated, and insisted that wages be further decreased 8% for every 25 cents coal dropped below $2.50. It was clear, however, that this announcement was made to provoke the Union into a strike during which the operators hoped to destroy the organization. One of the leaders of the Miners and Laborers Benevolent Association told the Philadelphia Times reporter that the war was not against wages as much as it was directly against our organization. A Mahoney City correspondent wrote to the Miners F. Ornell, "It is well known that the coal market can afford to pay last year's prices, but it seems that the wages question is not the trouble, but the disbanding of the M&LBA." First John F. Walsh, an English miner who had fought 3 years in the Union Army, led the strike which soon followed. The ruthless Goen, who was also president of the powerful Anthracite Board of Trade, later admitted in a report to his stockholders that he had spent $4 million to break the strike, and defended his action by saying that the money had been well spent because he had rescued the company from the arbitrary control of an irresponsible trades union. 8 Goen was assisted by the governor of Pennsylvania, who quickly sent in troops to break the strike. The miners had little money, but they had the sympathy of workers throughout the country. The Industrial Congress passed a resolution tendering heartfelt sympathies to the miners now locked out, and earnestly requested all organized bodies of workingmen throughout the country to forward to the Treasurer of the Congress as generous financial assistance as their circumstances will permit. Later, the President of the Congress issued another appeal to the workers of America, saying that the miners were engaged in a contest with the most powerful anti-trade union combination that has ever been formed in this country, and that these miners are fighting the battles of labor in this country. Similar appeals were issued by various sections of the international whirl. Men's Association. 9. The Marxists enthusiastically supported the miners' strike, but at the same time reminded the strikers that they would not succeed basically in changing. 458. Labor movement in the United States. Only a small amount of money was collected, and so the miners had to rely on their own small resources and their magnificent spirit. That spirit is expressed in a song that was written during the struggle. In 1875, our masters did conspire to keep men, women, and children without either food or fire. They thought to starve us to submit with hunger and with / too cold, but the miners did not fear them, but stood up brave and bold. Now 2 long months are nearly o'er that no one can deny, and for to stand another month we are willing for to try. Our wages shall not be reduced, though poverty do reign. We'll have 75 basis, boys, before we'll work again. 10. Before many weeks had passed, the miners in the northern anthracite fields accepted the wage cuts and returned to work, but the miners in the southern and middle fields carried on. "Since I saw you last," wrote a miner during the strike, "I have buried our youngest child, and on the day before its death there was not a bit of victuals in the house with 6 children. 11. The miners," wrote Andrew Roy, later mine inspector of Ohio, "made heroic sacrifices such as they had never made before to win the strike. In the closing weeks of the contest there were exhibited scenes of woe and want and uncomplaining suffering seldom surpassed. Hundreds of families rose in the morning to breakfast on a crust of bread and glass of water, who did not know where a bite of dinner was to come from. Day after day, men, women, and children went to the adjoining woods to dig roots and pick up herbs to keep body and soul together. 12. With part of the miners supplying coal, the operators were able to hold out until starvation forced the remaining miners to yield the Union their conditions as long as they fought only for wages, or for limitation of working hours. "Let the soil be ours," they appealed. "Let the factories with all their machines be ours. When in possession of these means, then also what is produced by and of them is ours. Then there will be no more need of strikes to increase the income from our labor, which our labor masters now reluctantly hand over to us, but every person will have the full income of his or her labor, and their full share of natural products. Therefore let us inscribe on our banners, down with work for wages. Arise and battle for possession of the materials." National Labor Tribune, September 25, 1875. The existence of 2 miners' unions was a factor in the defeat of the strikers. The W.B.A. was on friendly terms with the National Organization and even changed membership cards with the Miners' National Association. But its members, especially in the Schuylkill and Lehigh regions, refused to abandon the older union and enter the new national organization. As a result, locals of each union existed side by side in the same regions and, though they worked together, the unity of the anthracite miners was considerably weakened. Challenging the Great Depression. 45.9. Agreed to the wage cut but demanded that its authority for fixing the rates be recognized. The operators refused and the strike continued until June, when hunger finally had its way. "We are beaten," admitted John Walsh. "Forced by the unrelenting necessities of our wives and little ones to accept terms which, as we have already told the coal exchange and the public, we could never under any other circumstances have been forced to accept." 13 wages were cut 20%, signed agreements did away with provisions for weighing the coal, the union was broken, and Walsh and other union leaders were forced to leave the region. 7 months after the end of the long strike, the president of the Miners and Laborers Benevolent Association sadly admitted that the organization is decimated as it never was before. It is weak and tottery in most places, and in many has gone altogether out of existence. The miners dolefully sang. "Well, we've been beaten all to smash, and now, sir, we've begun to feel the lash. As wielded by a gigantic corporation, which runs the Commonwealth and ruins the nation." The long strike also brought an end to the once promising future of the Miners' National Association. John Siney and other leaders of the association had been opposed to the strike, and while the strike was in progress, Siney had told the executive board that strikes provided the source of most of our troubles, and were the cause of degrading our own class. Conciliation and arbitration were the best means of solving conflicts between capital and labor. 16 Siney overlooked the fact that he was dealing with employers who were dead set against unions, and no matter how willing unions were to compromise, the workers were unfronted by a coalition of industry which received government support. 1. Siney's own experience in the strike should have convinced him of this fundamental error. After the strike in Clearfield County, Pennsylvania, had lasted 3 weeks, the operators imported strikebreakers. A mass meeting was held to protest the action, at which Siney was present although he did not participate in the discussion. On May 12, 1875, he was arrested on charges of conspiracy. 26 other union leaders, including Zeno Parks, field organizer for the Miners' National Association, were arrested on the following day. Their trial once again was proof that the common law was still being used by the courts against the people. In his charge to the jury, Judge John Holden O's held that any agreement, combination, or confederation to increase or depress the price of any vendible commodity, whether labor, merchandise, or anything else, is indictable as a conspiracy under 460. Labor movement in the United States. The laws of Pennsylvania. The law was part of the common law which our forefathers brought with them from the mother country, and the same law under which the people of this state have lived since the days of William Penn. After the men in the Joyce Maloney case had been convicted of riot and conspiracy, Judge O's said in pronouncing the sentence, "I find you, Joyce, to be the president of the Union and you, Maloney, to be secretary, and therefore I sentence you to 1 year's imprisonment." 17 In a desperate effort to keep the Miners' National Association alive, Siney turned to the panacea of producers' cooperatives. But the membership did not have the capital, nor did they agree with their leadership that such cooperatives would harmonize labor and capital. The Associa tie-in disintegrated in 1876 without having opened a single mine of their own, and the members of the organization began to look to the Knights of Labor for leadership. 18 Goen and his associates were not satisfied with the destruction of the Workingmen's Benevolent Association only. They were bent on smashing all organized activity of the miners. For did not these workers still sing their song? When the men go back to work, they must all be determined to prepare for a struggle in some future day. The Molly Maguires. As wage cut followed wage cut, the miners fought back, led by an Irish fraternal and patriotic organization, the Ancient Order of Hibernians. They had belonged to the order when their union was strong, but now it became their secret organizational center. In most studies of American labor history, the secret activities of the miners after the strike of 1875 have been associated with acts of violence in eastern Pennsylvania that began in 1862 and continued for 20 years. These crimes are said to have been committed by a secret society, the Molly Maguires. Recent research has revealed a different story. It is now established that there was no society in America calling itself the Molly Maguires, that this name was tagged to the Ancient Order of Hibernians by the commercial press, whose purpose it was to help the coal operators crush all organization in the mining industry, that the Philadelphia and Reading Company hired the Pinkerton spy agency not to save society from a band of terrorists but to spread terror, that during the 60s, as a result of labor's indignation and political pressure, a law exempting labor combinations from the charge of conspiracy was enacted at the next session. of Lehigh, Pennsylvania legislature, challenging the Great Depression. In early 70s, the operators had subsidized secret armed vigilante societies in Pennsylvania to murder and terrorize miners. As many miners were killed by these gangsters as were mine foremen and bosses by miners. No account of the offensive against labor during the Long Depression would be complete without a discussion of the trials of the so-called Mollies, men accused of murder and terror in the coal region. Goen was state prosecutor in a number of cases. If the Molly Maguires are eradicated, said Goen, we can stand up before the whole country and say, now all are safe in this country. Come here, with your money. Come here with your families and make this country your residence. Help us to build up this people and you will be safe. 19. The evidence against the accused men was supplied by James McParland, the Pinkerton spy who testified that he discovered the murder plots of the Molly Maguires. His testimony was corroborated by disreputable characters who secured immunity for their own crimes. Several witnesses who testified for the accused miners were indicted for perjury and sentenced at once to serve 2.5 years in the county prison. As a result, even close friends of the defendants were reluctant to testify in their behalf. It was generally admitted in the press that the corroborating witnesses for McParland contradicted themselves so often and told such incredible tales that no one could be convicted on their testimony in an honest trial. John Kerrigan, a witness who testified that he had joined several of the men on trial in killing a man named Yost, was accused by his own wife of killing the man himself and then accusing innocent men to suffer for his crime. Another witness for the prosecution declared that he had had a view of the faces of the men who had killed Thomas Sanger, a mine foreman, and he was certain that the man who had committed the crime was Thomas Munley because Munley sat in the courtroom in the same peculiar and constrained manner as had the 5 men seen on a fence about 500 feet distant on the morning of the murder. Goen admitted in his summation that the witness had not been asked if he recognized Munley by his face. 20. When another witness testified that she had only seen the side view of the murderer, and that the side view looks like the man. On trial, Goen said to the jurors, there are mechanical appliances that render identification instantaneous. The art of the photographer has discovered a method whereby, in an instant of time or less than an instant, in a pulsation of the heart, in the winking of an eye, you can take the picture of a man while he is moving at full speed before you. Why should not the eye of this woman be able to do the same thing? 21. Another witness recalled that the murderer had a slight mustache. 1162. Labor movement in the United States. But could not remember the color of his hair or eyes. His testimony was as reliable as that of his cronies. Q. Had you ever seen the man before? A. I never saw him before that morning. Q. Did you know him at all? A. No, I did not know him at all. Q. Have you ever seen him since? A. Yes, sir. Q. Munley, stand up. Is that the man? A. That is not the man I can recognize at all. 2c. But Munley was convicted. Practically all of the evidence was based upon McParland's statements, and, as the defense pointed out, it was not until the emissary of death, James McParland, had made his advent into this country that the crimes began. McParland's subsequent career was not so successful. In 1906, as chief of the Denver division of the Pinkerton Agency, he was hired by the state of Idaho to find the murderers of ex-Governor Frank Sturenberg. As a result of his evidence, William Haywood, Charles Moyer, and George Pettibone, leaders of the Western Federation of Miners, were arrested in Denver, Colorado, kidnapped and taken to Boise, Idaho, where they were charged with the murder. During the trial of Big Bill Haywood, Harry Orchard testified that he had killed the ex-governor at the instigation of the Union leaders, and had been influenced by McParland to turn state's evidence. Under Clarence Darrow's brilliant cross-examination, Orchard revealed that he had been carefully coached by McParland. Darrow proved that McParland had used Orchard the way he had used Kerrigan in the Molly Maguire cases to railroad labor leaders to their death. 23. The mass movement in defense of Moyer, Haywood, and Pettibone was instrumental in securing their freedom. Absence of such a mass movement in the Molly Maguire trials made possible the carrying out of lynch sentences. The Labor Standard and the Irish World exposed the plot of the coal operators, but these papers were not influential enough to organize a movement great enough to save the condemned men. Protest meetings were held in many industrial centers. A mass meeting in Philadelphia spoke out against the hasty and inhuman manner in which the so-called Molly Maguires have been sentenced to death. On January 13, 1877, a mass meeting of New York workingmen, called by the Working Men's Party, adopted a set of resolutions which asserted that the charges against the condemned men were chiefly based upon the testimony of an infamous person named McParland, who has been actively engaged in the service of the mine owners, accused the mining corporations with having endeavored to cover with odium the working men of Pennsylvania for the Purpose of diverting attention from their own cruel and outrageous robbery of the workmen. Labor Standard, January 20th, February 24th, 1877. Challenging the Great Depression. The miners' national record refused to aid the men on trial, and the National Labor Tribune argued that if the labor movement joined in condemning the accused men, the commercial press would be convinced that organized labor did not approve of violence. 24 On June 21, 1877, the first group of condemned men were brought out in pairs for execution. Roerty, Carroll, Duffy, and Munley were executed in succession. "I have nothing to say, gentlemen," Carroll declared when asked to make a statement. "Only that I am innocent of the crime I am charged with." Other executions followed within a year, and the legal murders were over on January 14, 1879, when Sharp and McDonnell were hanged. These two men were executed just as a messenger arrived with a telegraphic reprieve from Governor Hartranft. The MS-3 Anger was not admitted to the scene of the execution, and the men were dead by the time the reprieve was placed in the hands of the proper authorities. Reporters stated that the reprieve seemed to have been timed to arrive just too late in order that the governor might win labor support, while he performed the work cut out for him by the coal companies. 25 The men whose lives had been sworn away by labor spies and perjurers, the Irish World observed in June, 1877, were mainly leading intelligent men whose direction gave strength to the resistance of the miners to the inhuman reduction of their wages. 26 A week later, the Miners' Journal, the operator's organ, corroborated this statement, and gave away the conspiracy. Referring to the men who had been executed the day before, it declared, "What did they do? Whenever prices of labor did not suit them, they organized and proclaimed a strike." 27. The most recent study of the Molly Maguires is by J. Walter Coleman, The Molly Maguire Riots, Industrial Conflict in the Pennsylvania Coal Region, published in 1936. This is in some ways a curious book. The author states that he had made a careful examination of the records of the cases and of the files of local newspapers, but hesitates to draw logical conclusions from the evidence he presents based on this research. He admits that the fact that the Pinkerton archives are not accessible to students renders it difficult to dismiss the charge that a conspiracy was entered into between the Philadelphia and Reading Company and the Pinkerton officials to manufacture evidence to convict a group of militant labor leaders, and he agrees that the subsequent activities of McParlin, particularly in the Haywood-Moyer Pettibone frame-up, show that the Pinkerton detective was quite ready to enter into such conspiracies. He also acknowledges that the men prosecuted were closely associated with the labor movement in the anthracite region, and as leaders in this movement they were obnoxious to the interests of the employers of labor, and that, for this reason, they were exterminated by means of funds furnished by leading mining and railroad companies of eastern Pennsylvania. Pages 171-72. Furthermore, he agrees that the trials were travesties of justice. Yet he reaches the conclusion that the responsibility for many of the violent deeds committed as a phase of labor disturbances I-5 not to be fixed by earthly judges. Page 175. To this writer it is clear that Anthony Bimba's The Molly Maguires publi head in 464. Labor Movement in the United States. TLI Great Strikes of 1877. All over the country employers shared the glee of the MMMG and railroad companies of Pennsylvania. During the years when textile workers and miners were suffering serious setbacks, the progressive governments in the South were being overthrown and replaced by governments dominated by planters and industrialists. With good reason, the Commercial and Financial Chronicle could report to Northern capitalists anxious to invest in the South that conditions were ideal for this year our 1877 Also, labor is under control for the first time since the war. 28 Every industrial and trade report echoed the words, "Labor is under control." And employers were now consumed with the hope that workers would no longer dare to resist wage cuts and ask for better working conditions. But in the summer of 1877, a short month after the first condemned men in Pennsylvania had been executed, our country experienced one of the most widespread and militant strikes in its history. The railroad workers had felt the impact of the Depression as keenly as any group of workingmen in the country. Their wages had been cut steadily until average weekly earnings amounted to $5 to $10 a week. Irregular employment reduced their wage still more. Men with families were permitted to work only 3 or 4 days a week, most of which time had to be spent away from home at their own expense. After paying $1 a day to the company's hotel, they frequently returned home with as little as 35 or 40 cents. To make matters even worse, the men often had to wait 2, 3, and even 4 months for wages which were supposed to be paid monthly. 29 Not even the docile and fraternal organizations of railroad workmen, the Brotherhood of Railway Conductors and the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen and Engine Men, were tolerated by the companies. Union men were blacklisted, Grievance committees were refused hearings, and the Pinkerton spies were so active that workers were afraid to talk to one another. The spark which set off the explosion was the notice of another 1932, which Coleman admits is substantiated by authentic documents, has come closer to the truth in concluding that the evidence makes it possible for earthly judges to see that the entire case was a conspiracy of reactionary employers against a militant labor movement. Even the conservative organ of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers acknowledged that the railway workers had good cause to complain of their conditions. Several months before the panic, it inquired, "Are not railway employees in this year of grace, 1873, enduring a tyranny compared with which British taxation in colonial days was as nothing, and of which the crack of the slave whip is only a fair type?" Ornal of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers, April, 1873. Page 162. Challenging the Great Depression. 465. % wage cut to take effect on the Pennsylvania Railroad on June 1st, and on many other lines a month later. This cut was brazenly announced as the railroad officials knew that the workmen had no militant organizations to lead them, and that thousands of unemployed were begging for work. But these officials had overlooked the fighting tradition and the temper of American workers. A reporter for the Baltimore Sun described the spirit of the strikers and their families in his account of the strike on the Baltimore and Ohio. The singular part of the disturbances is the very active part taken by the women, who are the wives and mothers of the firemen. They look famished and wild, and declare for starvation rather than have their people work for the reduced wages. Better to starve outright, they say, than to die by slow starvation. Another thing the rail operators overlooked was the fact that a great many people in America bitterly hated the railroads. Rate discriminations against individuals, firms, and whole communities, stock manipulation, bribery, corruption, and the wholesale robbery of the public domain had so infuriated the people that they welcomed the chance to aid the strikers. Even the commercial press, which attacked the strikers with unprecedented fury, was forced to admit that the vigor of the strike was due in no small measure to the fact that the railroad men were joined by farmers, miners, and small businessmen who shared a common hatred of the companies. The New York Tribune declared, "It is folly to blink at the fact that the manifestations of public opinion are almost everywhere in sympathy with the insurrection." 31. The insurrection had started on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad early in the morning of July 16, when 40 Baltimore and Ohio firemen and brakemen on freight trains stopped work. A freight train was halted at Camden Junction, outside of Baltimore. The police moved in and dispersed the strikers. Suddenly the strike spread all along the line. At Martinsburg, West Virginia, 1,200 brakemen and firemen seized the depot and stopped all freight trains, allowing only passenger and mail trains to move. When the mayor of Martinsburg had the leaders of the strike arrested, a large crowd leaped into action and soon they were released. Delegations of miners from the surrounding towns poured into the city to help stop any further arrests. The strike spread to other points in West Virginia. In the town of Kaiser, white and Negro railroad workers met together and voted to join the strike. They had soberly considered the step, and had finally decided that, at the precio.t state of wages which the company had imposed. 466. Labor movement in the United States. Upon us, we cannot live and provide our wives and children with the necessities of life. 32. Vice President King of the Baltimore and Ohio appealed to Governor Matthews of West Virginia to break the strike, and the governor dispatched the National Guard. The militia, composed of laborers and farmers, not only refused to shoot workers who were derailing freight trains, but fraternized with the railroad men, offering them their weapons. 33. Unable to rely on the militia, Governor Matthews wired President Hayes for federal troops. On July 19, a day after he received the request, Hayes dispatched troops to West Virginia, under the command of General French. 34. This marked the first time in our history that federal troops were used to suppress a strike in peacetime. The reporter for the New York World wrote to his paper from Martinsburg, "It has been well observed that if the rights of the strikers had been infringed or violated instead of that of the railroad corporations, it is probable that Governor Matthews would have hesitated a long while before he would have thought it his duty to call on the President for aid." 35. General French arrested the leaders of the strike and reported to Washington that everything was quiet. But the strike was far from crushed. It spread to other parts of West Virginia and extended into Ohio and Kentucky. Canal boatmen, miners, and other workers turned out to redress their own grievances as well as to assist the railroad men. In Louisville, Kentucky, a gang of Negro sewermen stopped work, and with picks, shovels, and hoes on their shoulders marched through the streets, urging all other laborers to join them. Before night, wrote a correspondent from Louisville, there were several hundred, including some whites. 36. Meanwhile, troops were being mustered in at Baltimore to be sent against railroad workmen and miners at Cumberland, Maryland, who had stopped trains coming from Martinsburg. As the troops marched to the station, they were followed by several thousand Baltimore workmen who protested the sending of militia to Cumberland. When these workmen tried to prevent the departure of the troops, the militia fired into the crowd, killing 12 and wounding 18. The determined temper of the soldiers, wrote a correspondent for the New York Times, is evinced by the circumstance that all the men killed were shot through the head or heart. 37. The Maryland governor's plea to President Hayes for federal troops was also answered immediately, and with the aid of the troops the company started to operate the trains. Any worker who pleaded with a strikebreaker was instantly arrested. Every group of strikers who sought to stop trains from moving was immediately fired upon. Such tactics, challenging the Great Depression, reported the New York Times, disheartened and subdued the mob. 38 By July 22, the wholesale killings and arrests, the regular troops, militia and police, the vigilante groups, and the terror whipped up by the commercial press broke the strike on the Baltimore and Ohio. The strike that had begun on the Baltimore and Ohio in Maryland and West Virginia spread to lines in Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, Ohio, Illinois, Missouri, and California. The strike reached great intensity in Pittsburgh, for it was supported by all classes in the city. The only railroad between Pittsburgh and New York charged such exorbitant rates that the small businessmen as well as the rest of the population were filled with rancor against the railroad companies. Wage cuts were only one of many grievances of the men on the Pennsylvania Railroad. A few days after it had announced the new wage schedule, the company ordered that the number of cars taken out by one crew be increased from 18 to 36. Not only did this doubleheader edict mean twice as much work for less pay, but it meant that half of the workers would be fired. Shortly after the men were notified of the new wage cut, a committee of engineers visited Tom Scott, president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, and agreed to accept the reduction in wages if it would be rescinded when business improved. This agreement was not accepted by the workmen, who began to organize secretly under the leadership of R. H. Emmon, a young brakeman. They organized a secret industrial union, known as the Trainmen's Union, composed of engineers, conductors, brakemen, and firemen. A strike was set for July 27, 1877, but as the day approached, the engineers backed out and it looked as if the entire movement would fold up. Then came the news of the strike on the Baltimore and Ohio and the doubleheader edict of the Pennsylvania, and so the Trainmen's Union went ahead with its plans to strike. 39. At Pittsburgh, the strikers used the same tactics developed by the Baltimore and Ohio strikers. Large groups, including striking miners from Wilkinsburg and unemployed workers from Pittsburgh, assembled on the tracks and prevented the movement of freight trains, allowing only passenger and mail trains to pass. On July 21, Sheriff Fife, backed by the Pittsburgh militia, read the riot act to strikers on the Pennsylvania tracks. The sheriff was helpless when the workers refused to budge, as the militiamen refused to disperse the strikers. 40. A mass meeting called by the Trainmen's Union resolved not to go back to work until the wage reductions were rescinded, the doubleheader edict withdrawn, and all strikers re-employed. Delegations from Pittsburgh businessmen and from nearby mining towns assured the strikers of their support. The situation in Pittsburgh was tense, yet even the reporter from the New York Times admitted that the strikers had labor movement.nt in the United States 468 behaved well, and that only freight trains had been stopped. Instead of meeting with the union, the company called for more troops. The governor ordered the Philadelphia militia be sent to Pittsburgh. Colonel Tom Scott praised the governor and publicly boasted that he would settle this business with Philadelphia troops. 41 Scott was confident that his militiamen, fresh from banking centers and mercantile influences, would not fraternize with the mob. En route to Pittsburgh, the militiamen boasted that they were going to clean up the city. Even the Army Fornell admitted that the Philadelphians were spoiling for a fight. 42 They soon had their chance. When they tried to arrest the leaders, the people resisted. They greeted the soldiers from the rival metropolis with groans, hoots, and hisses. A few boys hurled 2 or 3 stones at the militia. The troops replied by firing directly into the crowd, killing 20 people, men, women, and children. 29 people were wounded. A grand jury investigation termed the action an unauthorized, willful, and wanton killing which the inquest can call by no other name but murder. 43 The community was enraged. Thousands of workers from the rolling mills, coal mines, and factories hurried to the scene of the killings. Crowds surrounded the soldiers, driving them into the railroad roundhouse. All night the troops were besieged by an aroused citizenry determined to avenge the murder of the workers. The roundhouse burst into flames, and the troops were forced to withdraw. The Union Depot at Pittsburgh and the terminals of the Pennsylvania Railroad were also afire. Just who set the fires is still in doubt, but the National Labor Tribune charged on September 15, 1877, that both the strikers and troops had played into the hand of conspirators, who aimed and seemed to have hit the bullseye to replace the worn-out rolling stock, etc., and save a big corporation from bankruptcy at the public expense. Scare headlines in the commercial press increased national apprehension. On July 22, the New York World reported on Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh sacked. The city completely in the power of a howling mob / Its news column told its readers that Pittsburgh was in the hands of men dominated by the devilish spirit of communism. President Hayes ordered soldiers to guard Washington. A proposal was made at a cabinet meeting to declare the state of Pennsylvania in insurrection, and to call for 75,000 volunteers. Newspapers, clergymen, and public officials vehemently declared that the strike was another Paris Commune. An insurrection, a revolution, an attempt of communists and vagabonds to coerce society, an endeavor to undermine American institutions. 45 reacting to their own headlines, the newspapers called for more bloodshed. The strikers, said the New York Tribune, knew but the logic of force. It was futile to show mercy. Challenging the Great Depression. To the ignorant rabble with hungry mouths. To the New York Herald. The mob is a wild beast and needs to be shot down. The New York Sun recommended a diet of lead for the hungry strikers, while the Nation called for federal sharpshooters. The strike on the Erie Railroad in New York began on July 20th, when firemen and brakemen turned out to protest the firing of workers who had met with management on the rescinding of the wage cut. Before the cut, the average wage on the Erie was about $23 a month. When the strike was called, the company denounced Donahue, the leader of the strike, as a dangerous character who holds and disseminates communist views. 46 The strike spread to Hornellsville, to Jervis, Corning, Troy, Buffalo, and to Erie, Pennsylvania, finally involving the New York Central and Lake Shore railroads. Whenever the militia was called out, it fraternized with the strikers. At Buffalo, a company of the militia went over to the strikers, and at Elmira, the local troops were reported to be in open sympathy with the strikers. 47 An officer of the 69th New York Regiment informed the Labor Standard that many members of the regiment, composed of Irish workingmen, were in perfect sympathy with their oppressed fellow workmen. The officer continued, "Many of us have reason to know what long hours and low pay mean, and any movement that aims at one or the other will have our sympathy and support. We may be militiamen, but we are workmen first." 48. William Vanderbilt, president of the New York Central, ordered the wage cut on his road rescinded and promised the Buffalo strikers a 25% wage increase if they went back to work. At the same time, he distributed $100,000 to the strikers and unemployed workers of the New York Central. However, the men never got the wage increase. 49. Like a circle in a great pool, the strike widened every hour, moving farther and farther westward until it reached the Pacific coast. To ward off the strike, the Central Pacific Railroad in San Francisco rescinded a 10% wage cut which had gone into effect on June 1st. Several shipping companies granted concessions for the same reason. Unfortunately, demagogues were able to sidetrack the strike movement into anti-Chinese riots. 50 As the strike wave spread from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the Canadian border to the Mason-Dixon line, the cry of communism became louder and louder. The railroad strike was said to be the work of agents operating for the Working Men's Party who had learned their lessons from the socialist leaders in the Old World. They were using IHE strike as a signal for a revolutionary uprising to overthrow the government and establish an American commune. 51 Actually, because of the disruptive work of the Lassalleans in preventing effective trade union work. 470. Labor movement in the United States. The newly organized Working Men's Party had had little contact with railroad workers prior to the strike. 52 Party leaders and socialist leaders like those on the Labor Standard had predicted a major upheaval on the railroads, and consequently were not caught unawares by the great strike actions in the summer of 1877. As soon as the strikes were called, the National Executive Committee of the Working Men's Party ordered all sections to call mass meetings, to offer resolutions for an 8-hour law throughout the Union, for the abolition of all conspiracy laws, and for the purchase by the federal government of the railway and telegraph lines. In Philadelphia, Newark, Paterson, Brooklyn, New York, and other eastern cities, the Working Men's Party sponsored mass meetings which expressed their support of the strikers and condemned the government for helping the railroad operators break the strikes. A mass meeting called by the Working Men's Party in San Francisco was attended by 10,000 people who expressed their sympathy for the families and friends of those who have been shot down while fighting the battle of oppressed labor. 53 Before the meeting was over, a gang of hoodlums broke it up by trying to turn it into an anti-Chinese demonstration. In Cincinnati, the Working Men's Party appointed a committee to contact the railroad men, and worked closely with the strikers, while in Chicago and St. Louis it was in the leadership of the strike. In Chicago, as in other western cities, it took on the aspect of a general strike. On July 24th, workmen at the Michigan Central freight yards downed tools. Soon workers in other yards stopped work, and during the day most factories and shops in the city were shut down. On the following day, Police charged the strikers at the Michigan yards with guns and clubs, arresting the leaders. But terror could not stop the spreading strike wave. 800 coal miners in St. Clair and Madison counties turned out demanding an increase in wages, an 8-hour day, and payment twice a month. They expressed sympathy with the railroad strikers in Chicago and pledged to render whatever assistance they were called upon to give. In Cairo, Illinois, a number of Negro stevedores struck for an increase in wages from 20 to 30 cents an hour. Their demands were granted, but before returning to work, the Negro workmen pledged full cooperation to the strikers in other parts of the state. 54. On July 25, the New York Times announced, the city in possession of communists. The Working Men's Party had helped arouse the workers of Chicago. 2 days before the strike started on the Michigan Central, the party had held an emergency conference, after which it issued a call for a mass meeting to be held the following day. About 20,000 workers answered the call, many of them marching to the demonstration with banners on challenging the Great Depression, which were written, "We want work, not charity. Why does overproduction cause starvation? Life by wharf or death by fight." 55 George Schilling and Albert R. Parsons were among the leaders of the Working Men's Party to address the meeting. Parsons urged support for the railroad workers who were on strike in the eastern states but said nothing about a strike in Chicago, nor is there any evidence that the party had anything to do with the walkout of the switchmen of the Michigan Central. Once the strike had begun, however, the party appointed an executive committee to help in the general strike. This committee immediately issued circulars calling upon all workers to unite with the railroad men by shutting down every shop, factory, mill, and lumber company in the city. The members of the party among the cigar and furniture workers took the lead in spreading the strike. Throughout these turbulent days, the socialist leaders, especially Albert Parsons, moved among the strikers, telling them to remain peaceable but firm, and signing up hundreds of workers who wished to join the Working Men's Party. 56 Chicago's mayor and police force stopped warning workers, and on July 26, a pitched battle took place between police and strikers at the Halsey Street Viaduct, which ended when a contingent of cavalry charged the crowd with drawn swords, killing 12 and wounding several score. Chicago had become a second Pittsburgh. The Board of Trade organized citizen patrols, and federal troops armed with repeating rifles came to the city from the Sioux country. Parades of strikers were broken up, leaders of the Working Men's Party were arrested, and workers' headquarters demolished. In the street fighting, between 30 and 50 men were killed and almost 100 wounded. Gradually, the strike in Chicago was crushed, and on July 28 freight trains moved under military guard. 57. Meanwhile, events were moving so fast in St. Louis that the Republican, the city's leading newspaper, exclaimed, "It is wrong to call this a strike, it is a labor revolution." 58 Here, the Working Men's Party issued an announcement calling a mass meeting for July 22. "We are asking the public to condemn the government for its action in sending troops to protect capitalists and their property against the just demands of railway men." Several thousand workers attended the meeting, which condemned the government for allying itself with capital and against workers who are attempting to secure just and equitable reward for their labor. The meeting agreed that, "We will stand by them in this most righteous struggle of labor against robbery and oppression, through good and evil report, to the end of the struggle." 59 A mass delegation was formed to visit a meeting to be held by railroad workers in East St. Louis. When the delegation came to the 472 labor movement in the United States river which divides the city, they decided to cross by ferry since the bridge was run by a monopoly. Inspired by the delegation from the Working Men's Party, the railroad men voted to quit work the following day. An executive committee representing one man from each road was appointed and empowered to set up subcommittees for each separate branch of the industry: brakemen, firemen, switchmen, trackmen, section men, wipers, and blacksmiths. Before adjourning, the meeting adopted a resolution calling on the men not to drink liquor during the strike, and suggesting that if anyone should become intoxicated, his friends should take him home. 60 The company offered to restore wages at the scale that existed on May 15, but the strikers demanded the wages paid prior to January 1877. On July 23, freight trains were ordered stopped. Passenger trains were permitted to move, and special care was taken to let all mail trains through. When the executive committee learned that the men on the Missouri Pacific had decided to go back to work after gaining their demands, it visited these workers and urged them to stay out until a general settlement had been made. They refused. Whereupon, the executive committee left, only to return the next day with an engine and 2 flat cars carrying several hundred strikers. The men formed into line and marched with fife and drums to the Missouri Pacific shops. This was most effective. The workers stopped and joined the strikers. Demonstrations were organized on a citywide scale, railroad strikers going from shop to shop urging the workers to join them. A prominent part in these demonstrations was played by the Negro workers who worked on the levee. One reporter, on July 26, wrote from St. Louis. This afternoon, great crowds of strikers and some 300 Negro laborers on the levee visited a large number of manufacturing establishments in the southern part of the city, compelling all employees to stop work, putting out all fires in the engine rooms and closing the buildings. The colored part of the crowd marched up the levee and forced all steamboat companies and officers of independent steamers to sign pledges to increase the wages of all classes of steamboat and levee laborers 60 to 100%. 61. As the strike spread throughout the city, it was directed by the Working Men's Party, which first sponsored a parade embracing 1,500 workers. When the procession ended, a mass meeting was held and resolutions were adopted expressing support of the strike, calling upon the strikers to prevent disorder and violence, and not to give up the strike until the 8-hour day and living wages for the laboring men of St. Louis had been secured. Later, a committee was set up to organize a general strike. This committee, officially known as the Executive Committee United, challenging the Great Depression. Working Men of St. Louis was under the leadership of members of the Working Men's Party. 62. The first act of the Executive Committee was to call for a general strike for wage increases, for the 8-hour day, and for a law prohibiting the labor of children under 14. Many firms instantly granted their workers wage increases. But this was not enough. The strike mounted. By July 29, all places of business in the city were closed. At first, the city authorities practically left the Executive Committee in charge of the city. When the receivers of the St. Louis and Southeastern Railroad asked Mayor Overstolz to arrest the strikers, he refused, because of his inability to do so. 63. But very soon, the city authorities joined with committees organized by prominent merchants to suppress the strike. The St. Louis Gun Club contributed shotguns, and 5,000 muskets came from other sources. Some $20,000 was raised by a committee of merchants to arm a force of 1,000 men. When Governor Phelps threatened to declare martial law, the Executive Committee urged him to convene the legislature and speak out for the passage of an 8-hour law and for a measure prohibiting the employment of children under 14 years of age. Nothing short of a compliance to the above just demand, the committee declared, will arrest the tidal wave of revolution. 64 militiamen, police cavalry, armed vigilantes, and federal troops took control of the city. The headquarters of the strikers was raided, 73 men were arrested and 49 imprisoned with no charges placed against them. The members of the Executive Committee were arrested on charges of conspiracy, and the high bail of $3.00 for each man forced them to remain in prison. The mass movement broken, the strike was soon crushed. 4 members of the Executive Committee were sentenced to a 5-year prison term and fined $2.00 each. 65. By August 2, the strike was over. Here and there, the companies adjusted some of the grievances, but those who went back to work found the wage reductions still in effect. Many returned to their jobs feeling that they had gained nothing from the 2 weeks of struggle, but there were others who remembered with great satisfaction the sight of white and colored men standing together, men of all nationalities in one supreme contest for the rights of workingmen. 66. The American capitalists drew a lesson from the national strike wave. They saw the importance of a militia controlled by wealthy men, a larger standing army, and more and better armories. During the next few years, the militia in several states was centralized, more armories strategically built, and conspiracy laws enacted against the trade unions. Labor learned 2 fundamental lessons from the Great Strike. First, that future success would depend upon effective national organization along trade union and political lines. The role of the local, state, and labor movement in the United States. National governments in crushing the strike convinced workers that no reliance could be placed on either of the major parties. Second, labor realized that executive committees set up during a struggle and scattered mass meetings were not enough. Strikers with hungry families to feed required swift relief payments. Hastily established committees could not meet this need. The railroad strike proved the necessity of strong unions with an adequate dues system to meet strike expenses. Asterisk. Since this book was published in 1947, a number of new works have appeared on the miners' labor unions in eastern Pennsylvania and the Molly Maguires. Most important of these are Marvin W. Schlegel, ruler of the reading, The Life of Franklin B. Goen, Philadelphia, 1947, Clifton K. Yearly, Enterprise and Anthracite, New York, 1961, Wayne G. Broll, Molly Maguires, New York, 1964, and Harold W. Orand, From the Molly Maguires to the United Mine Workers, The Social Ecology of an Industrial Union, 186-1897, Philadelphia, 1971. A number of these works accept the accounts of those who have maintained that there was a terrorist element among the ancient order of Hibernians, known as the Molly Maguires, and that this element did in fact conspire to commit a number of murders before and after 1872. In general, however, they reject the view that the Mollies were intimately connected with coal unionism. My own view still is that there were actually no organized terrorist groups in the coal regions. That even individual terrorists had no connection with unionism among the coal miners, and that fundamentally the entire Molly Maguire issue was a frame-up engineered by Franklin B. Goen. In any case, one of Dr. Oran's points is well worth quoting. He notes, "The Molly Maguire investigation and trials were one of the most astounding surrenders of sovereignty in American history. A private corporation initiated the investigation through a private detective agency, a private police force arrested the alleged offenders, the coal company attorneys prosecuted them. The state provided only the courtroom and the hangman. The rapid disintegration of the political parties formed under the leadership of the National Labor Union caused many workers to lose interest in independent political action. On the other hand, during the hard times following the Panic of 1873, a feeling was mounting in the labor movement that trade unions were powerless to remedy labor's grievances and that independent political action alone could aid the wage earners. In June 1875, the iron molders Fornell admitted that hundreds of the ablest men in the labor movement have lost hope as to the power and willingness of workingmen to fight capital to the bitter end through the organization known as trades unions. Hence we find them no longer urging the organization of labor into trade and labor unions, but urging organization for political purposes." 1. The rise of greenbackism. Leadership for independent political action during the Depression came from farmers rather than from wage earners. Several independent parties emerged in the western states between 1873 and 1875. That their appeals for united action with the workers were welcome can be seen in an article in the National Labor Tribune, published in Pittsburgh and edited by John P. Davis, a leader of the Knights of Labor in western Pennsylvania. In 1875, Davis wrote, "Farmers of the West, we welcome the hour when we can take your hand. The mechanic of the East, the vast army of laborers, stand waiting for the tocsin to sound, when they can, with you, rise up and possess this land and this government." 2. Unity between farmers and workers in the 70s was strengthened by the activities of the Order of the Sovereigns of Industry, which grew out of the patrons of husbandry, the Grangers, an educational, social, and mutual aid society for farmers. The order was mainly concerned with establishing consumers' co-zero imperatives. 475. Labor movement in the United States. As the Depression grew worse and trade unions disintegrated, trade union leaders and labor journals called upon the workers to join with the farmers in an independent political movement to destroy the money power. If only the government could be forced to issue greenbacks and aid workers' cooperatives by advancing credit at 3% instead of the 12% charged by the bankers, all would be well. The issuance of greenbacks would speedily end the Depression. Let the government print its own money, and pay it out to our starving people, the actual workingmen, for their labor in enterprises to be run and owned by the people at large through their hired agents, declared the National Labor Tribune. It is not necessary that the railroads should be built, owned, and controlled by private corporations. Let the government build railroads. Let us issue greenbacks for that purpose, and employ idle labor. 3. To some sections of the working class, the greenback movement was not viewed as a mere inflationary movement. Essentially, it was regarded as the opening wedge toward greater industrial democracy and a better social order. In the Greenback Party, however, none of these principles were emphasized, for labor had little influence in the movement. The party was mainly interested in more money to secure higher prices and was not concerned about changing the social order. The Greenback Party emerged from a series of conventions in 1875. Most of the representatives at these conventions were farmers and lawyers. For the distribution of necessaries of life among wage earners, and was designed for the laboring classes, especially working men and women. Circular entitled Private Instructions to Deputies and Masters. In Thomas Phillips' Papers, Wisconsin State Historical Society. The order cooperated in several cases with the patrons of husbandry, and even united with the patrons to maintain a C0-0 imperative store. The farmers and sovereigns, went one circular issued by the order, act as a unit in all purchasing as far as practicable. In a word, they join hands and concentrate the power of both organizations. This simple fact gives the sovereigns a great advantage over all other organizations in matters of making contracts. This brings directly to the homes of working people a saving that cannot be secured in any other way. Circular entitled Union of Grangers and Sovereigns. In Thomas Phillips' Papers, Wisconsin State Historical Society. Another circular declared, the order is and will continue to be, in thorough sympathy and hearty C0-0 operation with the patrons of husbandry, both being parts of one great whole, whose destiny is to work out a better future for the industrial classes of this country. Circular, dated January 1874, in Sovereigns of Industry Papers, Wis. Wisconsin State Historical Society. The total membership of the order in 1875 to 76 was said to be 40,000, of whom 75% were in New England and 43% are in Massachusetts. Its decline started in 1875, and by 1878 it was passing out of existence. See Commons Op. Cit., Volume 2, pages 171 to 75, E. M. Chamberlain, Sovereigns of Industry, pages 150 to 54, J. Butter. Field to John Samuel, Worcester, Massachusetts, January 31, 1877, Ms. John Samuel Papers, Wisconsin State Historical Society. 477. Political Action, 1873 to 1878. But a few leaders of unions that had gone to pieces during the Depression were usually present. At a convention in Cleveland in March 1875, John Siney, Richard F. Trevilick, Robert Schilling of the National Coopers Union, A. C. Cameron, and C. W. Thompson, the Negro Trade Union leader from the Tobacco Laborers Union of Richmond, Virginia, were present. The convention adopted a platform built on financial reform and set up a new party. The money question, it asserted, more deeply affects the material interest of the people than any other question in issue before the people. Payment of the national debt in greenbacks, and the issue of interconvertible legal tender currency bonds bearing not more than 3.65% per annum, were demanded. The new independent party became known immediately as the Greenback Party. In September 1875, a conference took place in Cincinnati, representing a movement led by Horace H. Day, a wealthy philanthropist who had been active in the National Labor Union. Day had refused to attend the Cleveland Convention as it was not representative of labor. In spite of Day's objections, the Cincinnati Conference voted to fuse with the Independent Party. The contribution of the Cincinnati Conference was a demand that was to appear in every greenback platform until 1879, the repeal of the Resumption of the Specie Payment Act, which had been passed in June 1875. Labor was represented at the first National Convention of the Greenback Party, which met in Indianapolis, May 1876, in the person of Trevilick, A. C. Troup, and John Hinchcliffe, but the convention was dominated by farmers, lawyers, businessmen, and politicians. Little recognition was accorded labor, either in representation on committees or in the platform. For, would not a repeal of the Resumption Act and the issuance of greenbacks end unemployment automatically? For the Greenback Party devoted its major campaign to winning support in the rural districts. A few labor papers, such as the National Labor Tribune and the Working Man's Advocate, conducted a campaign for its national and state tickets. In the mining districts of Pennsylvania, Trevilick, Davis, Drury, and other leaders of the Knights of Labor organized greenback clubs and sponsored meetings for the party candidates. 6. Most of the work of organizing working class support was done by John P. James, secretary of the Miners' National Association. James tried very hard to win over the socialists, and debated vigorously with members of the Working Men's Party on the importance of the greenback movement to the laboring man. In July 1876, the Working Men's Party adopted a resolution urging their sections to refrain from political action in the forthcoming campaign, and to support none of the parties in the 478. Labor movement in the United States. Field because they were dominated either by capitalists or by quacks. James asked the socialists to revise their stand, contending that lumping the Greenback Party with other parties was unjustified. It is purely a struggle of right against might, he wrote to the Labor Standard. Labor against capital, and every laborer in this country who is a voter ought to have his place in the lists of the independents. 6. A few socialists endorsed James' proposal, arguing that, with all its limitations, the Greenback Party was inculcating a hatred of monopolies and money despotism, laying bare their rascalities and robberies, sloughing off the old party politicians, giving new men and new ideas, and preparing the way for the final victory of labor. Most socialists disagreed with this stand, contending that the platform of the Greenback Party benefited not the working class so much as it did the demands of the real estate speculators and politicians. The financial demands of the party, when enacted into legislation, would not solve labor's problems, for the Greenbackers were only interested in the extinction of the national debts through the issuance of greenbacks. Peter Cooper, its presidential nominee, was, to be sure, a humanitarian, but he did not represent the working class. The Greenback Party, argued the socialists, was ignoring the reign of terror in the South in which the Ku Klux Klan was forcibly denying the Negro the right to vote and forcing them into a state of semi-slavery. No party, said the Labor Standard, which overlooked the problems of one section of the working class deserved the support of any worker. 7. The socialists were correct in 1876 when they refused to endorse the Greenback movement. At this time the new party offered little to workers and embraced but few of them in its ranks. The vote in the 1876 elections was proof that labor was far removed from the Greenback political movement. Chicago gave Cooper 251 votes out of more than 62,258. Cincinnati, 21 votes out of 47,000. In Philadelphia, 10 votes were cast for Cooper. In Pittsburgh, 93. In New York City, 289. And in Brooklyn, 50. The highest labor vote for Cooper came from the counties in Pennsylvania, scene of the Long Strike of 1875. Schuylkill County gave Cooper 1,238 votes, Luzerne County, 600, Dauphin County, 397, and Mercer County, 400 votes. 8 Little wonder that the National Labor Tribune, which had predicted a political revolution in the labor vote. The Working Men's Party was following a policy adopted at a Congress held at Philadelphia in April 1874 of the American sections of the International Working Men's Association. The resolutions on political action rejected all co-operation and connection with the political parties formed by the possessing classes, whether they call themselves Republicans, or Democrats, or Independents, or Liberals, or patrons of husbandry, Grangers, or Reformers, or whatever name they may adopt. Circular issued by the International Working Men's Association. Wisconsin State Historical Society. Political Action, 1873 to 1878. Was sorely disappointed. The results of the election, it said, are sickening. 9. 479. Labor parties and greenbackism. The terror which broke the great strikes of 1877 had taught the workers that living conditions could not be improved if the armed forces of the government were to be used to crush labor activity. Determined to nominate and elect men who would stand by the working class, the wage earners turned to independent political action. The workers' parties, which sprang up all over the country, in almost every industrial center between New York and San Francisco, were at first independent of the greenback movement. Soon a great many of them fused with the greenbackers because of the close relationships that had been built up during the strike between the workers, farmers, and small businessmen. The farmers had shown their solidarity with the strikers in their battle against the hated railroad corporations. When the strikers in Scranton set up a relief store, they were supplied with food by the farmers. The farmers in the surrounding country, reported the Scranton Republican, have proved themselves very generous, and in many instances have donated batches of potatoes to the cause. They are dug up and hauled to the store by committees appointed for that purpose, and afterwards distributed wherever required. 10. On July 23, 1877, the Breadwinners' League of New York called upon trade unionists, labor reformers, Grangers, and greenback men to unite for the formation of an independent party. As the platform for the new party, the League suggested 4 demands. First, that the government should immediately take control, own and operate the railroads. Second, enactment of labor laws for the protection of workingmen. Third, instant resumption of public works, with government fundi, to provide employment for unemployed workers. And fourth, repeal of all national bank charters and issuance of greenbacks in their stead. Citizens, the call concluded, organize, unite with us, and we will redeem the nation from bond, bank, and railroad monopolies by converting every city in this vast, rich, idle country into an actual work hop, every acre of its broad land into a farm, every mine into a source of life instead of a potter's field to its workers. 11. This appeal stated the principles upon which political activity was to be conducted in many American communities during the next 2 years. This activity was a fusion of 2 programs, the demand for financial reform and the demand for labor laws. The first greenback labor fusion took place in Pennsylvania in the 480 labor movement in the United States. Very heart of the district where the railroad strike, had been most extensive and violent. On August 13, 1877, a meeting in Pittsburgh, sponsored by the trade unions, formed the Unitical Labor Party. Its platform included the typical demands of the greenbackers, and called for protective tariff legislation, labor bureaus in the state and national governments, abolition of contract convict labor, workmen's compensation legislation, child labor laws, abolition of conspiracy laws applying to labor organizations, distribution of public lands to settlers only, and the establishment of courts of arbitration for the settlement of disputes between labor and capital. 12. Late in August, the Greenback Party of Pennsylvania and the United Labor Party appointed a joint committee to organize a united movement and write a common platform. The platform which emerged from this conference kept the original financial demands of the Greenback Party, adding a number of the labor demands raised by the United Labor Party. The 2 parties now fused. Most of the candidates nominated for offices had been nominated a few weeks before by the Greenback Party, but a number of labor men were added to the ticket. All of the labor men who ran for office under the greenback labor emblem were influential leaders in the Knights of Labor. 13. The fall election of 1877 saw an effective organization to gain public support for labor candidates and to bring out the vote. The work was conducted by greenback clubs which sprang up in those districts where the railroad strike had been fought and in centers where the Knights of Labor were influential. 20 new greenback clubs, the New York Tribune reported on August 13, 1877, have been organized around Pittsburgh and in the vicinity of Pottsville in the past few days. A similar fusion movement was taking place in Ohio. On September 13, a convention called by the Executive Committee of the Working Men's Party of Columbus, Ohio, met in that city. The convention voted to fuse with the Greenback Party and form a national party if the Greenbackers agreed to certain conditions. The Greenback candidates nominated the previous June were to be withdrawn, new candidates selected by a joint convention, and labor demands added to the Greenback platform. The Greenback Party accepted these conditions and a new convention was held. Stephen Johnson, whom the party had nominated for governor, was renominated, but the other candidates were selected from the ranks of the workingmen. A new platform was drawn up which advocated repeal of the Resumption Act and the National Banking Act and restriction of the issuance of money to the government, a graduated income tax, complete control by the government over all corporate bodies, and abolition of paying wages in store. Script. Point 14. The Working Men's Party of Cincinnati remained aloof from the political action, 1873 to 1878 Greenback movement. Meeting in convention on August 12, it refused co-join with this party, and nominated a full ticket for state officers. For school commissioner, it nominated a Negro, the superintendent of schools in the Negro section. During the railroad strike, Superintendent Clark had supported the strikers, and on several occasions had addressed mass meetings organized by the railroad men. Point 15 in New York. A labor reform convention was held at Troy on October 9, following an appeal of the Breadwinners' League issued during the railroad strike. This convention nominated an independent ticket for state officers and drew up a platform of labor reforms. John J. Junio of Syracuse, a cigar maker and trade union leader, was nominated for the office of Secretary of State. George A. Blair, of New York City, a leader in the Knights of Labor, State Controller, and Ralph Beaumont, shoemaker, State Senator. The labor demands in the platform called for reduction in the hours of labor, abolition of the contract system of prison labor, prohibition of manufacture in tenement houses, establishment of a Bureau of Labor Statistics, and state ownership and management of railways. The financial plank favored a currency of gold, silver, and United States Treasury notes, which should be a full legal tender for all debts, public and private, and the retirement of national bank bills. 16. Such a mild proposal for currency reform prevented the Greenbackers from proposing fusion, although at its state convention the party did place some of the labor reform candidates on its ticket. A few weeks before election, the Labor Reform Party set up a complete election organization in the upstate counties where large numbers of workers were employed in the shops and railroad yards. Here in Elmira, wrote a reporter for the New York Times, every ward has its labor reform headquarters in which well-attended meetings are held each night. In the words of one of the best-known Republicans in this part of the state, there has never been so complete and thorough a political organization since the days of the Know-Nothing Party. Each county has been divided into districts, which are in turn subdivided into wards and precincts, and in each of the divisions so made there are regular constituted and recognized leaders, whose duty it is to make the closest possible canvass of the districts allotted to their charge. Nearly all the men connected with the movement are workers in shops and factories. 17. The party's own newspaper, the Elmira Daily Bazaar, printed a pledge daily, which each worker in the area was asked to sign, promising to vote for labor candidates. One of the questions asked of all candidates was the attitude he had taken during the railroad strike. 482. Labor movement in the United States. An analysis of the election returns in 1877 reveals the impetus the railroad strike had given to the movement for independent political action. The vote polled by Stephen Johnson, the Greenback labor candidate for governor of Ohio, was almost 17,000, more than 5 times the Greenback vote of the preceding year. More than half of the votes were polled in those counties which covered the industrial cities of Toledo, Cleveland, Youngstown, Canton, and Columbus. Another quarter of the vote came from railway towns and industrial counties in the northeastern area of the state. In Toledo, the city ticket and some of the candidates on the county ticket were swept into office. Toledo sent 2 Greenback labor men to the lower house of the legislature. In Pennsylvania, the Greenback Labor Party polled 52,854 votes, 7 times more than the Greenback vote of the preceding year, and nearly 0% of the total vote cast. The vote came mainly from the anthracite and bituminous counties, the counties through which the Pennsylvania Railroad ran, and those adjacent to New York, the territory of the Erie Railroad. These counties contributed about 25% of the total vote. The New York Tribune commented on the voting. The coal miners and other rough and communistic characters went to the polls under the lead of their secret society officers and carried their ticket by 3,000 majority. 18. The Labor Reform Party of New York polled over 20,000 votes, 10 times the vote of the Greenback Party in 1876. Steuben County, which contained the town of Hornsville, the center of the Erie strike, and Chemung County, which included Elmira, gave the party 4,666 votes, or little less than 1/4 of the total vote. Rochester, another highly industrialized area, contributed 23% of the total vote. 19. The National Greenback Labor Party. The election returns in 1877 speeded up the organization of a national independent political movement. During the campaign, unity had already developed between Greenback and labor forces, particularly in the heavily industrialized states. In Pennsylvania and Ohio, the two groups had united and local Greenback labor organizations had been formed. The Baltimore and Louisville, Kentucky, working men's parties favored unity with the Greenbackers. In New Jersey and Massachusetts, both political groups had endorsed the same candidates, and in New York, the Labor Reform Party had already worked together with the Greenback forces in the elections. Not long after these elections, a call was issued for a National Convention of Labor and Currency Reformers, to be held in Toledo in Political Action, 1873 to 1878. February, 1878. The call had been sent out by D.B. Sturgeon, of Toledo, Ohio, chairman of the State Executive Committee of the National Party in Ohio, and was signed by prominent Greenbackers. Farmers, small businessmen, and workers discussed the coming convention and looked forward to a new political party that would speak and act for the plain people. 150 delegates, most of them from Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, attended the convention. Although such leading figures from the labor movement as Robert Schilling, Uriah S. Stevens, Richard Trevilick, and Ralph Beaumont were delegates, the convention was run by such men as E. P. Ellis and E. A. Boynton, prosperous manufacturers, and Walter P. Groom, secretary of the New York Board of Trade and editor of the Mercantile/Ornal. While Trevilick was honored with the temporary chairmanship, the permanent chairman was Francis W. Hughes, leader of the Greenback forces in Pennsylvania. The platform of the new National Party opened with a vivid account of the state of the nation. Business income and wages reduced, unparalleled distress inflicted upon the poorer and middle ranks of our people, the land filled with fraud, embezzlement, bankruptcy, crime, suffering, pauperism, and starvation. These conditions, it stated, were caused by legislation in the interests of, and dictated by, moneylenders, bankers, and bondholders. Nothing was said about the industrial capitalists who had slashed wages and forced their workers to sign yellow dog contracts. There were the usual Greenback demands, except that the interconvertible 3.65 bonds were not mentioned. The labor demands called for legislation reducing the hours of labor, national and state bureaus of labor and industrial statistics, abolition of contract prison labor, and prohibition of the importation of labor. 20. This mild program was attacked by the New York Tribune. Of course, all reasonable men can see that the Toledo resolutions mean calm Munism. The coming party is bent upon complete social and financial revolution. 21. During the winter and spring of 1878, unity among the different groups in the party was strengthened. Greenback clubs were organized in working class and farming districts. Greenback newspapers gained an enormous circulation, and Greenback pamphlets were carefully read and discussed by workers all over the country. It is not an uncommon scene, wrote a Pennsylvania correspondent of the New York Tribune, in the spring of 1878, to find a company of unemployed miners at street corners in Pottsville or Tamaqua, talking about the currency and general politics. One of the company who can. 484. Labor movement in the United States. Reed takes up a newspaper or a currency pamphlet, and discloses to his little crowd of listeners what it contains, and when he finishes they all join in a free open-air discussion. 22. In several states, workingmen's associations became Greenback clubs, and trade unions joined in recruiting members for the new movement. Wherever a local assembly of the Knights of Labor existed, there was certain to be a number of Greenback clubs. In New York City, the leaders of the Working Men's Union actively spread the doctrines of the new party. That the party's organizing work, helped by many volunteers, was effective is seen in the spring elections of 1878. In February of that year, Terence V. Powderly, soon to be Grand Master Workman of the Knights of Labor, was elected mayor of Scranton. The Democrats and Republicans had formed a joint citizens' ticket to defeat Powderly's Labor Reform or Molly Maguire ticket. "Down with this communistic oligarchy," cried the Scranton Republican. This paper dreaded the future of Scranton. With a succession of Powderlys in the mayor's offices and a non-tax-paying irresponsible rabble in power, Powderly's defeat was as certain as we look for the setting sun. Following Powderly's election, the Scranton Republican explained that hundreds of working men have been attracted into the meshes of communism. 23. In the spring elections in New York State, the new party, called the United Workingmen and Greenback Party, elected mayors in Elmira, Auburn, Utica, and Oswego, polled more votes than the Democrats in Rochester and Syracuse, and elected supervisors in 17 counties. These victories were the fruit of careful organization work conducted by workingmen in upstate communities. From Elmira, Auburn, Rochester, Utica, and Oswego came Greenback workingmen missionaries to the counties near at hand, to lecture to the farmers on the necessity of supporting the independent party candidates. The speakers, wrote a reporter for the New York Tribune from Elmira, were almost exclusively mechanics who worked in the shoe factories or machine shops of this city. After laboring at the bench 8 or 10 hours in the day, they would drive a dozen miles into the country, make a speech at a schoolhouse or in the open air, return at or after midnight, and report for duty in the shop at the customary hour the next morning. In this way, meetings were held in every school district of this county and greenback clubs were formed in many of the towns. 24. Despite the headway it was making, the greenback labor movement was nevertheless splitting apart. As early as May 1878, the basic indigo political action, 1873 to 1878 isms within the party were developing into a crisis. At the Pennsylvania State Convention, held that month, a split was narrowly averted. The labor delegates suffered a setback when Powderly was defeated by David Kirk in the election of chairman of the convention. Their major defeat came when the convention rejected Thomas Armstrong, publisher of the National Labor Tribune, as the candidate for governor and nominated Samuel Mason, a lawyer, who had no connection with the labor movement. It turned out later that he was the lawyer for the Pennsylvania Railroad. To make matters worse, the platform had fewer labor demands than had been advanced by the party during the previous year. It asked for the reduction of the hours of labor and the abolition of the contract system in prisons. But John Siney saved the day. Had it not been for him, the convention would have split. There are but two parties in the field, pleaded Siney. The party of the skinners and the skinned. The party of the robbers and the robbed. Come then, let us work together as laborers, as greenbackers, as all opposed to the rule of politicians of either the Republican or the Democratic Party. 25. The conflict in Pennsylvania was mild compared to that of New York. Late in July 1878, a convention was held in Syracuse for the purpose of solidifying the statewide Greenback Labor Party and nominating a state ticket. 4 separate delegations claiming to represent the movement came from New York City. 3 delegations came from Brooklyn, 3 from Troy, 3 from Albany, and 2 from Buffalo. A stormy debate over the seating of the New York City delegations ended with the exclusion of all the delegates of that city. The Nation reported that the conflict was one between the city and the country, the city representing mainly the labor reform and the country the greenback faction of the new party. The composition of the State Executive Committee set up by the convention revealed that the greenbackers dominated the party, for 2/3 of the members were currency reformers and only 1/3 were labor representatives. Nor was labor itself united. A labor leader like John J. Junio of Elmira openly stated that he considered that the settlement of the greenback question is the settlement of the labor question. Most of the candidates nominated by the convention were greenback politicians with little influence in the labor movement, and here, as in Pennsylvania, the platform contained fewer labor demands than that of a year ago. 26 The state platforms of the greenback labor parties generally reflected the strength of the working class in the movement. In Maine, where there was little or no labor support, the platform was financial and agrarian, and in Indiana the only labor resolutions were those asking for ventilation of mines and establishment of wages as a first lien on the 486. Labor movement in the United States. Property of corporations. In Ohio, Missouri, Illinois, and Massachusetts, where there was more labor participation, a good deal of attention was given to labor demands even though the financial reforms dominated the platforms. In Ohio, Andrew Roy, a leading figure in the miners' organizations, was nominated for Secretary of State, the most important office to be filled. Ben Butler, who had considerable labor support in Massachusetts, was the party's candidate for governor. He was later nominated by the Democratic Party as well. 27 Many platforms which contained demands for labor also contained denunciations of the red flag of communism imported from Europe, which asked for equal division of property. 28 That the working men did not believe in this red baiting is seen in a catechism distributed in leaflet form by working-class greenback clubs. Entitled, The Epistle of Nathan the Wise, the leaflet went in part. Then said the people to the wise man, What is communism? And the wise man answered them never a word, but bent his head over a paper and wrote upon it. And the multitude questioned him the more, saying, What is this thing called communism? Tell us, we beseech thee. And the wise man answered them and said, Not to gather and keep in my stores fine bread and fine meats, wine and fruits, treasures of gold and silver, and precious stones of which I have not need, nor cunning garments made by work, when my brother fainteth for a crust. This is communism. And a woman murmurs, Is this not Christianity? And an aged rabbi spoke, so taught Moses and the prophets from the beginning. And one from the land of Celestial muttered, so taught Confucius 6,000 years ago. And the wise man said, peace. Trouble not your hearts for a word. It is humanity. 29. The vote in the fall of 1878 represented the high point of the movement. Some 1,060 votes were cast for the Greenback Labor candidates for Congress, and 15 representatives were sent to Congress, 6 from the East, 6 from the Midwest, and 3 from the South. The congressional vote in Pennsylvania was almost 100,000, or about 14% of the total vote. Again, the Anthracite region contributed the largest share of the vote, although the vote fell 3,000 votes below that of 1877. In Luzerne County, the vote for the National Party dropped from 14,538 to 9,674, and in Dauphin County from 3,923 to 1,468. Dissatisfaction over the choice of candidates was responsible for this decline. 30. Fundamentally, the alliance of labor and the Greenbackers is on political action, I-873-1878. Stable. To Greenback advocates, labor's demands were of little importance because the Greenback theory stated that financial reform would solve all problems. Many Greenbackers weakened the coalition by such nonsensical statements as, they would have nothing to do with communism or trades unions, which are a kind of labor corporation. The maximum demands of the Greenbackers were well put by one delegate to a Greenback labor convention. All we want is greenbacks, a national money, and an honest government. 31. But the workers wanted much more. A writer for the Atlantic Monthly conducted a survey in the fall of 1878 to discover what workers expected to gain through the Greenback labor movement. Speaking to workers in Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey, he found that these workers were all agreed in their belief in absolute money, in desiring the government to become the employer of the people by constructing public works to an enormous extent, and in thinking that it should own and operate railroads, canals, and telegraphs for the benefit of the people, in favoring government ownership of land, legal prohibition of large accumulation of wealth by individuals, and the substitution, to a great extent, of the will of the people, as expressed each year, or each day, for fixed constitutional provisions and limitations. Other common demands were the shorter work day, all public officials to be elected by direct elections, a graduated income tax, public works, proportional representation. 32. By 1879, the only group left of a once powerful combination of workers and middle-class elements was the farmers. In 1880, the Greenback leaders called a conference to which came representatives from the Knights of Labor, the Greenback Labor Party, the California Working Men's Party, the Working Men's Party of Kansas, the Chicago 8-Hour League, and the Working Men's Union. The participation of the Socialists occurred after a long struggle led by Adolphe Douay, who maintained that in spite of the currency humbug, the labor demands of the Greenback Labor Coalition were important. As masses of American workers were in the movement, it was necessary for socialists to participate in the movement to salvage the good and make war on its shortcomings. How can they hear us? Asked Douay. If we shut ourselves up in our closet? How can they read our declarations, if they cannot get at them? And when they read them, do they not need explanation from us before they can fully understand them? 33. Ironically enough, by the time the socialists had made up their minds to work with the Greenback Labor Coalition, the workers had already left the movement. At the conference, the socialists were isolated, and the mild plank they had introduced against monopoly was skillfully sidetracked by a parliamentary trick. The platform's labor planks demanded the enforce. 488. Labor movement in the United States. Meant of the National 8-Hour Law, regulation of prison labor, prohibition of child labor under 14 years of age, and payment of wages in cash. 34. In the election campaign for the presidency of the United States, conducted by the Greenback Labor Coalition, James B. Weaver, its candidate, made special appeals to the farmers by calling for the regulation of railroads and the reservation of public lands to actual settlers. Despite broad organizational support in rural districts, Weaver polled only 300,000 votes. No campaign had been organized among the workers, Weaver doing most of his campaigning in the South. By 1882, the coalition had fallen apart, and Weaver was advising the party leaders to schedule his addresses in rural areas only, because the cities were hopeless. 35. Chinese exclusion. While the Greenback labor movement engaged the energies of the workingmen of New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and other eastern and midwestern states, workers in California were joining an independent political party whose purpose was the elimination of the Chinese from American life. Most Americans had welcomed the Chinese when they first came to America in large numbers during the gold rush of '49. In 1852, the governor of California had called the Chinese the most desirable of our adopted citizens, and recommended that land be given them to induce further settlement. However, Emigration was stimulated by steamship companies which found the importation of Chinese workers highly profitable, and by contract companies which were thus able to supply American employers with a cheap supply of workers to break strikes. In 1870-75, Chinese were employed to break a strike of the Knights of St. Crispin in North Adams, Massachusetts. The employer threatened that he would continue using coolie labor in order to free himself from the cramping tyranny of that worst of American trades unions, the Knights of St. Crispin. The Philadelphia North American urged employers to emulate their colleague in North Adams and use this cheap labor which cost less than $6 a month. The Boston Commonwealth agreed. These celestials belong to no striking organization, do not care to be out at nights, don't worry about their pay, do not presume to dictate to their employers. 36. There were two attitudes toward the Chinese in the labor movement. One view was that since a nation's wealth consists chiefly in its labor, which is its capital, American workers should welcome anyone China. Political action, 1873 to 1878. Man, African, or native of any country coming voluntarily to this soil. Opposition to the Chinese by dividing the working class only served T1C interests of employers. Instead of denouncing the so-called yellow menace, American workers should organize the Chinese and prevent employers from using them to reduce wage standards. Not for an instant should they confuse the struggle against unfair immigrant labor competition with anti-foreign prejudices. 87. Those who proposed this correct approach to the problem were few. Even A.C. Cameron, who was far in advance of other labor leaders in his belief that Negro and white workers should unite, took a wrong stand on the question of Oriental immigration. Yes, he wrote in the Working Man's Advocate of June 12, 1869, "Bring them along, Chinamen, Japanese, Malays, and monkeys, make voters of them all, acknowledge them as men and workers, mix them all up together, water down the old Caucasian race." The Arbiter Union, ably edited by Adolphe Douay, criticized these expressions of race hatred, but agreed that Chinese immigration should be stopped because their living standards were so low that it would take 100 years until they absorbed Western civilization. Tie-in. 38. With such an attitude coming from the advanced leaders of the labor movement, it is not surprising that so many workers opposed the Burlingame Treaty of 1868, under which the United States and China recognized the right of their citizens to emigrate to the other country. No sooner was the treaty ratified than the labor movement began a campaign to have it abrogated. This demand was advanced at each Congress of the National Labor Union after 1868, and was made of the planks of the National Labor Reform Party. The presence in America of Chinese labor, said the Labor Party, is an evil, entailing want and its attendant train of misery and crime, and should be prohibited. 8-9. Demagogy's brief sway in California. Most of the Chinese laborers who had been brought to America lived in California, and here, once the great railroads were completed, they entered the trades, moving gradually from unskilled to skilled occupations. The completion of the railroads, throwing thousands of men out of work, brought on the problem of unemployment several years before it had become a serious problem in other parts of the country. Demagogues were able to convince many workingmen in California that unemployment was due to coolie competition, and Chinese workers working for incredibly low wages gave these arguments plausibility. Many manufacturers and merchants who were beginning to feel the 490 labor movement in the United States effects of competition from Chinese businessmen in America joined in building up the bugaboo of the Yellow Menace. 40. On July 22, 1877, the workingmen of San Francisco met to express sympathy for the railroad strikers at a meeting sponsored by the Working Men's Party of the United States. Neither the speeches nor resolutions adopted by the gathering mentioned the Chinese question. But before the meeting was over, hoodlums disrupted the gathering by demanding that the speakers say something about the Chinese menace. When the meeting refused to be intimidated, the gang departed, making Chinatown their target. For several days the hoodlums wandered about the city, attacking Chinese laborers and demolishing Chinese laundries. The riots were finally quelled by a committee of safety which had organized a pick-handle brigade. One of the members of the pick-handle brigade was an Irish drayman, Dennis Kearney, well known for his sympathies with the employers, his attacks upon the working class, and his boasts that he had amassed a fortune from business ventures. Kearney had decided that his political future would be best advanced by joining a workingmen's movement. He tried to join the Working Men's Party of the United States, but was rejected as an enemy of the working class. He then decided to form his own organization, and with a small following he set up the Workingmen's Trade and Labor Union of San Francisco in August 1877. 3 months later, in October, he founded the Working Men's Party in California, with himself as president. His party proposed to wrest the government from the hands of the rich and place it in the hands of the people, where it properly belongs. Aimed to destroy land monopoly in the state, to provide decently for the poor and unfortunate, and declared its intention to destroy the great money power of the rich by a system of taxation that will make great wealth impossible in the future. These planks were a mask for the party's disruptive aim. We propose to rid the country of cheap Chinese labor as soon as possible and by all means in our power, because it tends still more to degrade labor and aggrandize capital. 41. The Kearney Party made rapid headway. Ward clubs were organized throughout San Francisco, meetings on the sandlots were held every Sunday night, and thousands of unorganized workers joined the Working Men's Party of California. Its prestige among workingmen increased when some leaders of the Socialist Working Men's Party of the United States united with the Kearney Party. Soon most of the members of the socialist movement in San Francisco had joined Kearney's party, giving it considerable strength. The Labor Standard urged all socialists to fight against the slogan, "The Chinese must go," and to expose Kearney as a demagogue who. Political action, 1873 to 1878. 491 was preventing a proper solution of the Chinese problem. Importation of Chinese workers for anti-labor activity, the Labor Standard went on, must be opposed, but Chinese workers in America should join with other workers to raise their wages through trade union activity. You can look in your shoe shops, wrote Caleb Tilley, an Eastern socialist leader, to the party in California. For some of the men that were made tramps not by Chinese, but by a more powerful enemy, an enemy that has no heart, no soul, that never hears your dying groans, capital. 42. Early in January 1878, Kearney and his associates were arrested and imprisoned for using language having a tendency to cause a breach of peace. 43. Having become a martyr by his brief imprisonment, Kearney was now convinced that no one would dare to oppose his leadership. But his high-handed and dictatorial tactics evoked resentment even among his own followers. Members of the Working Men's Party of California were infuriated by his practice of visiting ward club meetings, a calm pawnied by a gang of husky and noisy henchmen who would promptly disrupt any gathering that met with his displeasure. With the aid of his trained hoodlums, Kearney deposed ward club officers who criticized his tactics and appointed leaders who were subservient to him. "I am the voice of the people," he is reported to have said. "I am the dictator until the people put someone else in my place. I owe the people nothing, but they owe me a great deal." 44. Rumor that the voice of the people was owned and run by anti-labor interests, and that he had promised to put a stop to the movement if the businessmen of San Francisco handed over $0 was also creating an opposition to Kearney and his closest associates. Furthermore, the local trade unions gradually became hostile to Kearney because, opposed to organized labor, he gave the trade unions no representation in the party. For a while Kearney was able to retain control of the party by expelling all members, including a number of socialists, who opposed his policies. He gained control of the first convention of the Working Men's Party of California, held in San Francisco on January 21, 1878, but was not able to stop the adoption of a platform which departed from Kearney's disruptive politics. The platform stated that since the government of the United States was controlled by the capitalists, the rights of the people were ignored. Coolly, labor was denounced as a curse to the land and a demand for its restriction and abolition was raised. Other demands urged that ownership of land be granted only to settlers, that the financial system should be consistent with the needs of the agricultural, manufacturing, and mercantile industries and not the needs of bankers, merchants, and brokers, that the 8-hour day be the legal working day, the farming out of convict labor be halted, and all. 492. Labor movement in the United States. Labor on public works be paid prevailing wages. It also advocated that an end should be put to the growth of millionaires and monopolists through taxation, and that the President of the United States, the VI President and the United States Senators be elected directly by the people. Finally, it called for a system of compulsory education, secular in character, to be set up nationally. There should be instituted in all our public schools lectures, at stated intervals, whose primary aim should be to uphold the dignity of labor and mechanical avocations as paramount to all other walks in life. 45. During the early months of 1878 the party grew rapidly throughout the state, becoming a power in local elections. In a special election in Santa Clara County, on February 19, 1878, the Working Men's Party candidate for the Assembly was elected, defeating the candidates supported by the Democrats and Republicans. A month later, the Working Men's Party elected the mayor and city attorney of Sacramento. Like the Greenback labor movement, the decline of the Working Men's Party of California set in after its greatest victories. After March 1878, the party split into Kearney and anti-Kearney factions, and wherever the two factions nominated separate candidates in municipal elections, defeats were suffered. Other factors hastened its disintegration. A number of candidates elected by the party were old-line politicians or manufacturers, and once in office they disregarded the organization's principles and voted for measures denounced by the workingmen. By May 1878, 2 executive committees had been set up. The anti-Kearney forces, many of whom were trade unionists, issued an address to the people of California, accusing Kearney of being a dictator, of selling out to the enemy, and of acting as an irrepressible disorganizer and an enemy of the party, persuading men to folly, riot and disorder, breaking up clubs, and otherwise damaging and disgracing the party. 46 From this point on, the story of the Working Men's Party of California is largely one of internal dissensions and petty squabbles. A few victories were won in this period of dissension. A new state constitution was adopted mainly through an alliance between the Working Men's Party and the Grangers, and in 1879 the party elected Isaac S. Colick, mayor of San Francisco. But in 1880 the Working Men's Party failed to elect its candidates, and soon after it fused with the declining Greenback Labor Party. The Working Men's Party of California, though it degenerated into a racket, and the Greenback labor movement, controlled though it often was by manufacturers and politicians, had far-reaching consequences. Both brought the question of monopoly to the fore, and were influential in arousing public support for a number of important labor demands. Both movements were instrumental in forcing old established parties. Political action, 1873 I-878. 493. To listen more attentively to the demands of the common people. This consequently resulted in the passage of laws in various states establishing bureaus of labor statistics, ending the farming out of convict labor, setting up systems of compulsory education, and abolishing payment of wage in anything but lawful money. The Socialist Movement. The Unity Congress of the Socialist factions in 1876 did not end the conflict between the Lassalleans and the Marxists. The Lassalleans were determined to ignore the mandate of the Congress that political campaigns should be organized only when the party was strong enough to exercise a perceptible influence. The defeat of the Great Strikes of I-877 was seized upon by the Lassalleans as proof that the ballot box was the only effective weapon with which to fight the capitalist class. Strikes and unemployment demonstrations, they argued, could never succeed because the moment they began to be successful the government sent in the police, the militia, and the army to crush the movements. Since the government officials could not be removed by trade union action, only an independent political party representing the exploited masses could change the situation. Once the state was captured through the ballot, a socialist society would be close at hand. 47. Aided by the general trend toward political action following the railroad strike, the Lassalleans, or political action, socialists were able to persuade many sections to ignore the decisions of the Union Congress and to rush into politics. At first the results were very favorable. In the autumn municipal and state elections of 1877 the socialist vote increased considerably. In Chicago the vote was 7,000, Cincinnati, 9,000, Buffalo, 6,000, Milwaukee, 1,500, New York, 1,800, Brooklyn, 1,200, and New Haven, 1,600. At the Working Men's Party convention held in Newark on December 26, 1877, the political action, socialists gained complete control of the movement. Its name was changed to Socialist Labor Party and the Constitution and Declaration of Principles were completely revamped. All obstacles to immediate campaigning were removed, and the main purpose of the party, it was now asserted, was the mobilization of the working class for political action. In a subsidiary statement it was affirmed that the party should maintain friendly relations with the trade unions and should promote their formation upon socialistic principles. But it was made quite clear that the chief function of the Socialist Labor Party was the organization of political campaigns. Its guiding J. P. McDonnell of the Labor Standard and his followers stayed away from the convention. Labor movement in the United States. 494. Principle became science the arsenal, reason the weapon, the ballot the missile. The new party met with considerable success at the polls during the spring and fall elections in 1878. The vote in Chicago in the spring election was about 8,000 and 2 socialist aldermen were elected. The following fall the socialists in Chicago elected 4 members to the legislature, 1 senator and 3 assemblymen. In St. Louis 3 socialists were elected to the legislature, and in New York the socialist vote was 4,000 or twice the vote polled in the previous election. 48 Naturally, the political action, socialists regarded the election results as a vindication of their position. But in reality it was not the Lassalleans who were responsible for these victories as much as it was the Marxists or trade union socialists who had opposed the Lassallean concentration on political action only. Swallowing their disagreement with the Lassalleans, the Marxists in Chicago, St. Louis, and New York mobilized their trade unions behind the socialist candidates, distributed leaflets on election day, and in every possible way united trade union and political action groups. In Cincinnati, however, where the Lassalleans held sway, no connections with the trade unions were established. Consequently, the socialist vote actually declined after the fall of 1877.49. Subsequent elections proved that the Marxists had been correct when they warned that a rush to the ballot box without careful preparation in advance, and without trade union support, would never secure lasting results. The socialist vote in the autumn elections in 1879 was disappointing, falling in Chicago from 12,000 to 4,800. The political action, socialists shrugged off the result with statements that the return of good times made an end to socialist success inevitable, and that the working men are still blind and thoughtless. The return of good times was rapidly drawing the plundered toilers back into their old paths, and causing the socialist vote to dwindle. But even Philip Van Patten, Lasallian leader of the Socialist Labor Party, was forced for the time being to admit the correctness of the Marxist position. The key man in achieving a coalition of the trade unions and the Socialist Party in Chicago was Albert R. Parsons. He was both an active socialist and a militant trade unionist, being elected president of the Amalgamated Trade and Labor Unions of Chicago and vicinity. By no means a thorough student of Marxism, Parsons did at this time favor both economic and political action. By forming trade unions and voting independently at the polls, he declared the workers would ere long call a halt to the increasing power of aggregated wealth which is surely turning our fair America into a land of paupers, tramps, and dependent menials. Alan Calmer, Lalor Agitator, The Story of Albert R. Parsons, N.Y., 1937, page 38, and Albert Parsons' Scrapbook, Mrs. Wisconsin State Historical Society. Political Action, 1873 to 1878. The only reliable foundation today is the trade union organization, he wrote. And while political efforts of a spasmodic nature will often achieve temporary success, yet the only test of political strength is the extent to which trade union organization backs up the political movement. 50. By 1880, the organized socialist movement was splitting wide apart into irreconcilable factions. The trend was away from the political action, socialists, and was hastened by two events that occurred in I-88. During the spring elections in Chicago, the socialist candidate for alderman in the 14th Ward, Frank A. Stauber, emerged victorious only to be fraudulently deprived of his seat by the election judges. Although Stauber was finally allowed to obtain his seat, the incident convinced many socialists that little faith could be placed in the ballot as a method of achieving a new social order because successful socialist candidates would simply be prevented from taking office. Soon after this occurrence, the Socialist Labor Party split over the manner of participation in the presidential election of 1880. The majority was in favor of fusion with the Greenbackers, and the party, it will be remembered, participated officially in the Greenback Convention which nominated James B. Weaver. One wing, however, insisted upon nominating independent socialist candidates, and in Chicago this group, headed by Albert R. Parsons, nominated its own local ticket. 51 Disillusioned with political action and losing faith in voting as a weapon for achieving a socialist society, some of the leaders of the socialist movement split away from the party. One group swung sharply to the right and began to advocate a type of unionism which would have nothing to do with politics. Another group advocated abandoning the ballot, educational propaganda by word, the struggle for immediate demands through the trade unions, and substituting physical force, arming of the workers, and propaganda by deed. The ranks of the evolving anarchist movement were swelled by the arrival of socialists. As far back as 1875, a small group of German socialists in Chicago had formed one armed club which came to be known as Lehrjugend Wehrverein. The attack on the workers during the Great Strike of 1877 by the police, the militia, and the United States Army resulted in the spreading of the movement started by the club. Although most of the members of these armed groups belonged to the Socialist Labor Party, the National Executive Committee of the party denounced such organizations on the ground that they gave a false picture of the objectives and policies of the socialist movement. In 1878, all members of the Socialist Labor Party were ordered to leave these clubs, but this order was resented by socialists in Chicago and intensified the schism in the party. Morris Hilkett, History O.J. Sociale, M. in the United States, New York, 1912, page 213, A. Sartorius Freiherrn von Waltershausen, Der moderne Sozialismus in den Vereinigten Staaten 11 on America, Berlin, 1890, pages 158 to 60, Commons, Op. Cit., Volume 2, 280 to 81. Labor movement in the United States. Who had been forced to flee from Germany after the passage of the anti-socialist exceptional laws in October 1878. Soon social revolutionary do-s made their appearance in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, RNL-E, and Chicago, composed of foreign-born workers who d belonged to the Socialist Labor Party or who had recently arrived from Germany. Eventually the new organizations were to federate and form the Revolutionary Socialistic Party. This party's platform, adopted at a convention in 1881, urged the organization of trade unions on communistic principles and asserted that aid should be given only to those unions which were progressive in character. The platform also denounced the ballot as an invention of the bourgeoisie to fool the workers, and recommended independent political action only in order to prove to workers the iniquity of our political institutions and the futility of seeking to reconstruct society through the ballot. The chief weapons to be used in combating the capitalist system were the armed organizations of workingmen who stand ready with the gun to resist encroachment upon their rights. 52 Very few workers in America were full-fledged anarchists. In the main, those who were influenced by the anarchist philosophy were class-conscious, militant trade unionists, who had lost faith in the efficacy of the ballot as a result of the increasing use of troops and local police to crush strikes, the widespread corruption in politics, and the inability even to seat labor candidates when they were elected to office. After the election of 1880, the socialist movement split into several groups. One group tried to rebuild the badly shattered Socialist Labor Party. Another group developed pure anarchism in New York and other eastern cities under the leadership of Johann Most, who arrived in this country from England in 1882. Out in Chicago and other cities of the Middle West, Albert H. Parsons and August Spies led a group which combined trade unionism with anarchism, and in the Rocky Mountain and Pacific Coast labor movement, Burnett G. Haskell, a lawyer who hated his profession, and Joseph R. Buchanan, a leader of the Knights of Labor, proposed propaganda by deed and emphasis on education and trade unionism as the means to achieve a universal revolution from the throes of which the new world will be born. Almost unnoticed, another group was beginning to develop the principles which would powerfully affect the destinies of the American working class, the pure and simple trade unionism, the new unionism, of the American Federation of Labor. During the long depression of the 70s, the trade unions in many industries lost the majority of their members, but at no time did trade unionism disappear. The iron molders' Forno reminded employers that though the labor movement was exhausted, the spirit of resistance to wrong, which is the spirit of trade unionism, will never die while labor can be wronged, either by individuals or the law. 1. Revival of trade unionism. Business began to revive by the middle of 1878, and a year later industrial recovery was in full swing throughout most of the country. These next few years were to bring huge profits to the Carnegies, Rockefellers, Goulds, and Morgans as trusts and monopolies concentrated the economic life of the nation more and more in their hands. But to labor, the revival of industry did not automatically bring higher wages, shorter hours, and better working conditions. As a result of the struggles of organized workers, the length of the working day had been reduced from the 14 and 15 hours common earlier in the century. In a few rare instances, early in the 80s, workers had won even the 8-hour day, but most workers were still as far from the 8-hour day as they had been in the 60s. Most New England textile workers in 1883 had an average working day of a little over 10 hours. Bakers in the same year worked from 80 to 120 hours a week, organized cigar makers from 55 to 60 hours a week, unorganized cigar makers from 66 to 90 hours a week, and transportation workers in most urban centers from 90 to 0 hours a week. 2 Samuel Gompers, president of the Federation of Trades and Labor Unions of the United States and Canada, estimated that wages in 1883 were lower than those of 1870. The average annual wage for industrial $497. 498. Labor movement in the United States. Workers in the 5 most important manufacturing states, New York, Massachusetts, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Illinois, Gompers asserted, came to less than $400. 3 Wage statistics gathered in the period do not fully coincide with Gompers' estimates, but they substantiate his conclusion that a considerable number of American workers lived in poverty. The average annual living cost of a working-class family in 1883 was put at $754.42, while the average income of a worker was $558.68. The unions which came through the Depression of the 70s formed the foundation of the modern labor movement. There were 18 national unions in 1880, half of which had been formed before the crisis. Beginning in 1879, 4 unions increased their membership as follows: 5. 1880. Bricklayers. Printers. Cigar J/Fakers. Carpenters and Joiners. 303. 6,520. 409. 1881. 1,558. 7,931. 12,000. 2,042. 1882. 6,848. 10,439. 2 for 30. 3,780. 1883. 9,193. 12,273. 13,214. 3293. Fully as important as the growth in membership of the national unions was the rise after 1879 of city central bodies in every important industrial center. In all the principal cities, went a report of September 1880. The trade unions are allied for mutual assistance with central councils or trades assemblies. 6. There were a few trades assemblies which extended over an entire county, such as the trades assemblies of Essex County and Passaic County, New Jersey, and Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. Local central councils of the building trades were organized in a few cities, the council in New York having 25 unions. Another type of city federation was the United German Trades, formed in New York, Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Louis, and other cities where there was a large German working class. 7. The United German Trades were closely related to the Socialist Labor Party, supported its candidates for office, and helped circulate socialist papers. The influence of socialists in the trades assemblies was not confined to the German central labor bodies alone. Many of the trade assemblies were organized by socialist trade unionists, and the Bulletin of the Socialist Labor Party was not exaggerating when in September 1880 it stated that the establishment of city central labor bodies all over the country has been accomplished mainly by the efforts of socialists who influence, and in some places control these assemblies, and are respected in all of them. Nor was Lucien Saniel, leader of the Socialist Labor Party in New York, painting a false picture when he wrote in September 1879, "We dare say that trade unionism in many of the largest cities of modern labor movement begins. 499 America would be small indeed if our own men, the socialists, did not, as active members of their respective trade unions, infuse into them that life and spirit of which these organizations give from time to time some startling evidence. *8 It was due to the socialists in the trade unions of New Orleans, Galveston, Houston, and Savannah that the trades assemblies in these cities admitted unions of Negro workers on an equal basis with other unions. In the same cities, federations were organized of unions of longshoremen, draymen, yarmen, cotton classers and markers, scale hands, weighers and reweighers, pressmen, and crewmen, to which Negro and white workers were equally eligible. This democratic policy adopted by the Southern Central Trades Assemblies and waterfront federations did much to break up the antagonism between white workers and Negro workers. In November 1883, a parade of the unions composing the Central Trades and Labor Assembly was held in New Orleans. 10,000 workers marched in the line, representing all countries, colors, and industries, and the demonstration was so successful that it was repeated in 1884 and 1885. The trades councils took the lead in negotiating agreements between employers and striking unions and in the enforcement of boycotts. All of them were active on the political front, some through independent political action and others by promoting labor legislation. To cite but one case, in 1882 the Trades Assembly of San Francisco set up a legislative committee to propose labor measures, interrogate candidates for office, and lobby for legislation at the state capitol. The committee drew up a list of questions which were submitted to all candidates for public office, covering such issues as employers' liability, factory inspection, postal savings banks, government ownership of railroads, free textbooks, weekly payment of wages, and the abolition of child labor. Union members were *. The following letter sent by P.J. McGuire, formerly a Lassallean socialist but now a confirmed trade union socialist, to Philip Van Patten, leader of the Socialist Labor Party, gives a vivid illustration of Saniel's point and indicates the origin of the Carpenters' National Union. It was sent from St. Louis on April 15, 1881. Our carpenters' strike is a glorious success. Liebkite and I managed it. I have got Liebkite active at work in the movement. We have raised our wages to $3 per day, and after 2 weeks' strike we now have only 82 men out on strike, where over 800 were out this day a week. Next Monday we go to work. We have given 2 weeks gratis to hold them out, and the carpenters will do anything for us. Last Sunday we had a mass meeting of over 1,000 carpenters. Bigger trades meeting never was held in St. Louis. We have got lots of new members for our union. Last night organized carpenters union of 70 men in St. Louis. I received letters from all cities asking me for information and asking me to organize a national carpenters union. I will do so. Socialist Labor Party Correspondence, Mrs. Wisconsin State Historical Society. See also Gerhard Seger, P. Fitzpatrick S. Robert Wilson, to Philip Van Patten, December 1, 1879, June 2, December 4, 1880, Socialist Labor Party Correspondence. 500. Labor Movement in the United States. urged to support only those candidates who replied favorably to the questionnaire. 1 degree. Through their political activities, the trades assemblies often prevented state legislatures from enacting anti-labor laws and forced the passage of legislation demanded by organized labor. Thus, several trades assemblies succeeded in stopping the passage of anti-labor conspiracy laws, and many were successful in their campaigns to secure the establishment of bureaus of labor statistics and the enactment of labor laws. Perhaps the most important activity of the trades assemblies was the promotion of organization campaigns among the workers of their communities. Through the efforts of the San Francisco Trades Assembly, the following trades were organized in the early 80s: hod carriers, pattern makers, boiler makers, foundry laborers, machinists, beer bottlers, custom cutters, metal roofers and cornice makers, cardmen and coal haulers, blacksmiths, bag and satchel makers, house movers, coopers, brass molders and finishers, ship painters, plumbers and gas fitters, marble cutters, varnishers, marble polishers and rubbers, stair builders, wharf builders, watchmakers, painters, and expressmen. Similar results were achieved by trades assemblies of other cities. 11 By uniting the local unions at a time when many of them were not yet affiliated with their national organizations and when no effective national labor federation yet existed, the trades assemblies established labor solidarity and guaranteed success to many campaigns to organize the working class, to secure better living standards, and to achieve the passage of labor legislation. The International Labor Union. Important as the activities of the trades assemblies were, they confined their work for the most part to the skilled workers. The organization of the unskilled as well as the skilled workers was undertaken during this period by two organizations, the International Labor Union and the Knights of Labor. Although its life was only 5 years and did not survive 1882, the International Labor Union is important for what it represented and what it attempted to do. It was the first great effort to organize all unskilled workers in one union, and by uniting them with the trade unions of skilled workers to achieve nationwide labor solidarity irrespective of nationality, sex, race, creed, color, or religion. The International Labor Union was organized early in 1878. It developed from a united front established about this time between several former international and 8-hour leaders. Disgusted with the domination of the Working Men's Party of the United States, B.V. the Lassallean modern labor movement begins. 501. Politicals. Sorg, McDonnell, Dewey, and Otto Wademeyer, son of Joseph Wademeyer, joined with Ira Stewart, George E. McNeil, and George Gunton to campaign for immediate demands around the slogan, shorter hours and higher wages. Their strategy was to build a mass working class organization whose aim was the abolition of the wage system. At a conference early in 1878, J.P. McDonnell and George E. McNeil organized a provisional central committee of the International Labor Union with members in 18 states. Among them were Albert R. Parsons and George Schilling of Chicago, Otto Wademeyer of Pittsburgh, F.A. Sorg of Hoboken, New Jersey, George Gunton and Ira Stewart of Massachusetts. An executive board of 7, with George E. McNeil as president, functioned for the Provisional Central Committee when that body was not in session. The Central Committee prepared a declaration of principles, this platform representing a compromise of the two groups that had combined to form the organization. 1 To the part dealing with principles and ultimate aims was the product of the Stewart wing of the coalition. It declared that the wage system is a despotism under which the wage worker is forced to sell his labor at such price and such conditions as the employer shall dictate. That as wealth of the world is distributed through the wage system, its better distribution must come through higher wages and better opportunities until wages shall represent the earnings and not the necessities of labor, thus melting profit out of existence, and making cooperation, or self-employed labor, the natural and logical step from wages slavery to free labor. That the first step towards the emancipation of labor is a reduction of the hours of labor, that the added leisure produced by a reduction of the hours of labor will operate upon the natural causes that affect the habits and customs of the people, enlarging wants, stimulating ambition, decreasing idleness, and increasing wages. The part of the platform dealing with demands was a joint product of the two groups on the Provisional Committee. We therefore severally agreed to form ourselves into a committee known as the Provisional Central Committee of the International Labor Union, whose objects shall be to secure the following measures: the reduction of the hours of labor, higher wages, factory, mine and workshop inspection, abolition of the contract convict labor and truck systems, employers to be held responsible for accidents by neglected machinery, prohibition child labor, the establishment of labor bureaus, labor propaganda by means of a labor press, labor lectures, the employment of a general organizer, and the final abolition of the wage system. 502. Labor movement in the United States. Tactics were distinctly influenced by Sorg, McDonnell, and the other former internationals on the Provisional Committee. The methods by which we propose to secure these measures are: first, the formation of an amalgamated union of laborers so that members of any calling can combine under a central head, and form a part of the amalgamated trades union. Second, the establishment of a general fund for benefit and protective purposes. Third, the organization of all workingmen in their trades unions, and the creation of such unions where none exist. Fourth, the national and international amalgamation of all labor unions. 18. It may seem surprising that Marxists were ready to accept that part of the platform dealing with principles and ultimate aims. Certainly Sorg and his colleagues had no illusion that the wage system would be abolished automatically through the 8-hour day. Unlike Stewart, they did not believe that the capitalists would voluntarily abandon their ownership of the means of production and turn their factories over to the workers as soon as their profits had been absorbed into the wages of the workers through the operation of the 8-hour day. But the Marxists and the 8-hour leaders did agree on two principal points in the program. The wage system was a despotism, and the first step towards the emancipation of labor is a reduction of the hours of labor. Sorg and his colleagues were ready to make concessions because they regarded the 8-hour movement led by Stewart as an oasis in the desert of the currency reform humbug. Further, the Marxists believed that the International Labor Union provided the means by which the majority of American workers, skilled and unskilled, could be organized into trade unions and through their struggles come to see more clearly the need for socialism. 14. The object of the International Labor Union was to build a mass labor organization. The International Labor Union, said President McNeil, presents a plan by which the unorganized masses and local unions can become affiliated. Its aim, he said, was to band together Jew, Greek, Irishman, American, English and German, and all nationalities in a grand labor brotherhood. Through it the trade unions would be stimulated into a new and more vigorous life. And in it workers of any nationality, creed, or color would join hands together, until freedom shall be achieved for all. 16. Adolf Dewey hailed McNeil's statements and stressed the special need of carrying the principles of the International Labor Union to Negro workers in the South. Modern labor movement begins. The Negro population of the South deserves our kindest and most careful attention. They are almost the only laboring people there. Few of them are anything but wage slaves. Without their gathering into our fold, one half of this country must remain adverse or indifferent to our movement. Beginning with their enlightenment in our purposes in such places as Baltimore, Washington, Louisville, St. Louis, and wherever our labor unions are spreading, we might achieve what otherwise cannot be done. We might loosen the hold of their white employers on them. 16. Although the founders of the movement intended an organization that would unite all unskilled workers in America, the International Labor Union was dominated by textile workers, a great many of whom were working women. The repeated wage reductions in the textile industry during the Depression years as well as the long working day made these workers ready for organization. As soon as McNeil, McDonnell, Gunton, and other leaders of the International Labor Union carried the message of organization to textile labor, unions sprang up in every textile center from Vermont to New Jersey, and strikes immediately followed. Many of these strikes were spontaneous, and some were led by other organizations, but all were influenced by the International Labor Union. The great strikes of the textile workers during 1878-80 in Paterson and Passaic, New Jersey, Clinton and Cohoes, New York, and in Fall River, and other cities, are indications of the great labor solidarity that was built in the short and brilliant career of the International Labor Union. The strike of I-88 in Cohoes, New York, ended in a complete victory, the strikers gaining a 0% wage increase and 50 minutes for dinner. More than 5,000 workers struck, most of whom were members of the International Labor Union. 11 Led by the International Labor Union, the 1878-79 strike in Fall River was one of the greatest in American history. It was carefully prepared for several months by the local branch, and by the time of the walkout to secure higher wages and the 9-hour day, over 5,000 workers had joined the organization. On May 8, 1878, during the course of the strike, 25,000 workers marched in a parade held under the auspices of the International Labor Union, and raised as their slogans, "The object of the International Labor Union," wrote Carl Speyer, General Secretary of the International Union, 2 years after it was organized, "is chiefly to organize the unskilled laborers. Those are often dangerous competitors to mechanics, and consequently the trades unions are benefited by the existence of the International Labor Union and fully sympathize with us and assist us where they can. To induce mechanics to join us would be interfering with the trade unions who regard the International Labor Union as an associate." Papers of the International Labor Union, Mrs. Wisconsin State Historical Society. Labor Movement in the United States. 504. We want less work and more pay. We want to work 9 hours a day. We want a full hour for noon. We want these things and we want them soon. Peace. There is no peace. There shall be no peace until our I-5% is restored. In unity is strength. Join the International Labor Union. 18. But the many strike failures caused a rapid decline in the membership of the International Labor Union. By February 1880, there were no more than 500 members in the organization, and a year later it went to pieces. In 881 there remained but one branch in Hoboken, New Jersey, where F.A. Sorg lived. In 883 Sorg reorganized the branch as the International Labor Union of Hoboken. To unite the members of the International Labor Union, for the purpose of aiding the trade unions of New Jersey in attaining favorable labor laws. 4 years later, when Sorg left Hoboken for Rochester, New York, the branch dissolved. At no time did the International Labor Union have more than 8 members, but many times that number belonged to it for short periods and were influenced by its principles. These workers were to carry their labor solidarity and class consciousness into the organization of the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor. Immediately following the Civil War, the Knights of Labor was not an important force in the labor movement. It began to make its influence felt during the Depression years. Late in 1873 an attempt was made to coordinate the existing local assemblies. Local Assembly No. I issued the call to all assemblies asking them to elect delegates to a convention for the purpose of founding a district assembly. At this convention, District Assembly No. 1 was set up in Philadelphia, comprising 31 local assemblies, and the ritual was put into written form. Having established a permanent central body, the order, hitherto confined to Philadelphia, began to expand into New Jersey and western Pennsylvania. The order is moving westward. The National Labor Tribune informed its readers early in 1875. A little later it announced, "The secret order of labor has taken a deep hold on the workingmen of the country. The order is spreading silently, like the rising of a tide it is labors." In February 1880, Carl Speyer listed the following branches of the organization: Omaha, Nebraska, English branch; Council Bluff, Pennsylvania, English branch; St. Louis, Missouri, English branch; Carterville, Illinois, English branch; Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, German branch; Hoboken, New Jersey, German branch; Paterson, New Jersey, English branch; Paterson, New Jersey. Silkweavers branch No. 14. Papers of the International Labor Unions, Mrs. Wisconsin State Historical Society. Modern labor movement begins. Coming salvation. The door is open to all good men, and they are welcomed as brothers by a brotherhood of toilers, who are making the elevation of labor their religion. In 1874, District Assembly No. 2 of Camden, New Jersey, was founded, and in August 1875, District Assembly No. 3 was organized in Pittsburgh. From this center, organizers moved into surrounding regions including West Virginia. The growth of the order during these years was uneven. Groups joined and left in quick order when they found that the organization did little to raise wages. Most recruits came from unattached local unions that had never belonged to a national trade union, or from national trade union locals that had been disrupted during the Depression. Thus the large locals of the Miners' National Association, the Machinists' and Blacksmiths' National Union, and the Knights of St. Crispin moved in and out of the order. The universal membership idea of the order was well suited to the mining industry, which had always been organized along industrial lines, and its early secrecy permitted the miners to continue in the labor movement after the defeat of the Long Strike of 1875.21. Since the Knights of Labor had no platform, before 1878, constitution, or declaration of principles, organizers for the order called preceptors could promise workers that by joining the organization every problem facing them would be solved. Naturally, when the promised results were not forthcoming, workers became disillusioned and left. It was inevitable, therefore, that a demand should arise for the establishment of a national organization which would bring order out of chaos, unite the widely separated parts of the society, and direct the movement along well-defined harmonized lines. 22. A very important impetus towards centralization within the order was provided by the secrecy issue. The commercial press was quick to associate secret labor organizations with the Molly Maguires, and the cry was raised that the Knights of Labor, a branch of the Mollies, was plotting to overthrow the government of the United States. Added to this was the fact that the Catholic Church made it quite clear that it was hostile to all secret societies and especially to those with rituals and vows which might conflict with the confessional. The Knights of Labor had been founded by Protestants, but when it moved into the mining districts of Pennsylvania, the order gained many Catholic members. The hostile attitude of the priests in these counties to the order affected its growth and quickly brought the secrecy issue to the fore. 23. When the Pittsburgh Convention in 1876, referred to above, failed to unify the existing labor organizations and create a consolidated national organization, the Knights decided to set up an independent national 506 labor movement in the United States. Organization of their own. A convention for this purpose, called by District Assembly No. 1, met in Philadelphia in July 1876. The convention was attended by 35 delegates, 22 of whom came from Philadelphia and Reading. Pittsburgh, which felt that it rather than Philadelphia was the real center of the order, was not even represented. The convention did not take up the question of changing the policies of the order, including secrecy, but adopted a constitution for a national body which was to be known to outsiders as the National Labor League of America. The League was empowered to control the secret ritual, which it could modify by a 2/3 vote. All other powers remained with the district assemblies. A second convention, called by District Assembly No. 3 and attended only by its followers, met at Pittsburgh in May, 1877. The most important action taken at this meeting was the declaration that the name and object of the order should be made public and the provision that a new Catholic member could, if he considers it his duty, confess to his father confessor. 24. It was the Great Strike of 1877 which proved the need for the centralization of the Knights of Labor. The Knights had participated as individuals in the strike, but Terence Powderly insisted that the only influence the order exerted officially was to counsel moderation, peaceful methods, and avoidance of contacts with radical elements. As more and more workers moved into the Knights of Labor, following the strike, the need for centralization increased. By the end of 1877, 11 new district assemblies had already been set up, bringing the total to 14. The order now extended into New York, Massachusetts, West Virginia, Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana, as well as Pennsylvania and New Jersey. With District Assembly No. 3's consent, District Assembly No. L sent out a call for a convention to meet at Reading, Pennsylvania, January 1, 1878. For the purpose of forming a central assembly, and also for the purpose of creating a Central Resistance Fund, Bureau of Statistics, providing revenue for the work of organization, establishment of an official register, giving number, place of meeting of each assembly, etc. Also the subject of making the name public. 25. The Reading Convention set up a central national form of organization for the Knights of Labor and adopted a set of principles which, with some slight changes, served as the constitution of the order throughout its existence. It called attention to the alarming development and aggressiveness of great capitalists and corporations, which, unless checked, will lead to the pauperization and hopeless degradation of the toiling masses. If the workers were to enjoy the full blessings of life, they would have to check unjust accumulation and the power for evil of aggregated capital. This could only be done when the workers' modern labor movement begins. Were organized. The goal of the Knights of Labor was to bring within the fold of organization every department of productive industry, and to secure to the toilers a proper share of the wealth that they create. The platform advocated a Bureau of Labor Statistics, cooperative institutions, both productive and distributive, reservation of public lands for actual settlers, weekly pay for employees, mechanics' liens, the abolition of the contract system on public works, arbitration of labor disputes, the adoption of laws providing for the health and safety of those engaged in mining, manufacturing, and building industries, the recognition by incorporation of trade unions, prohibition of the employment of children under 14 years of age, equal pay for equal work for both sexes, prohibition of the importation of foreign contract labor, establishment by the government of a national currency, issued directly to the people without the intervention of any system of banking corporations, which money shall be legal tender in payment of all debts, public or private, organization by the government of postal savings banks, ownership by the government of all telegraphs, telephones, and railroads, and, finally, the reduction of the hours of labor to 8 per day, so that the laborers may have more time for social enjoyment and intellectual improvement, and be enabled to reap the advantages conferred by the labor-saving machinery which their brains have created. The preamble of the Knights of Labor followed closely the preamble and platform of the Industrial Brotherhood organized during the Depression years. Strike action was deplored, and the preamble states that most of the objectives in the platform can only be obtained through legislation. The Knights regarded monopoly as an evil and wanted it abolished. The way to do it, they believed, was through government ownership of the railroads, telegraphs, and telephones, elimination of the private banking system, and substitution for it by a postal savings bank. 26. Not until a cooperative society took the place of the wage system would the inevitable tendency toward monopoly be halted. The order had to be the instrument through which in time financial and industrial emancipation of the world's workers from corporate tyranny and wages slavery is to be achieved. 26. In spite of its confusion, the order's platform advanced a program aiming at the organization of the entire working class and the abolition of wage slavery. Its structure and methods, however, were not suited to the attainment of these objectives, and were frequently detrimental to the satisfaction of other specific demands. The Constitution adopted by the Reading Convention set up a national body styled the General Assembly of the Knights of Labor of North America. at whose annual meetings delegates from the various district organizations and unattached local assemblies would elect officers and 508. Labor movement in the United States. Decide questions of general policy. The General Assembly had full and final jurisdiction over the organization. It alone possessed the power and authority to make, amend, or repeal the laws and regulations of the order, to decide all controversies arising in the order, to issue all charters, traveling, transfer, and final cards. It also had the power to tax the members for the maintenance of the order. Point 27. Constitutionally, it appeared that the Knights had a highly centralized form of organization, but actually, the local and district assemblies were virtually autonomous and did as they pleased. As a rule, the general officers acted only as they were forced to by the national trade unions, local and district assemblies. Centralization was more formal than real. Point 28. The difference between theory and practice derived fundamentally from a conflict between the leadership and the membership. While the membership was finding that through strikes and boycotts they could secure important gains for labor, the leadership emphasized the futility of strikes and argued that only through self-employment could labor obtain lasting victories. Strikes could not solve labor's problem, said Terence V. Powderly in 1882, because strikes cannot change the apprentice system, a strike cannot remove the unjust technicalities in the administration of justice, a strike cannot regulate the laws of supply and demand, for if it cuts off the supply it also cuts off the demand, by throwing consumers out of work, thereby curtailing their purchasing power. 29. That same year, Robert D. Layton, General Secretary of the Order, wrote jubilantly, "On the subject of strikes, I have discharged a duty. I promised myself and some of the grand officers some time ago, i.e., to give strikes a left-handed blow somewhere near the stomach. I think if vigorous, although crude, language will unseat, or tend to dethrone His Satanic Majesty in our order that I have as an individual did a little toward that end." 30. Both Powderly, who replaced Stevens as Grand Master Workman in 1879, and Layton frequently urged the Knights to remain at work and use the funds that would be consumed in strikes for the purpose of establishing cooperatives. Thus the failure of the strikes of the 70s led the leaders of the Knights of Labor to repudiate the strike except as a weapon of last resort. At the first General Assembly in 1878 a sum of money was set aside as a resistance fund during strikes. 2 years later, the General Assembly voted to have 10% of the fund used for education, 60% for cooperative purposes, and the remaining 30% for strikes. This assembly also outlined strike procedure. The first step called for the election of an arbitration committee by the local assembly involved in the strike. If this committee failed to adjust matters, the district assembly with which the local was affiliated was to appoint a district committee on arbitration. If the dispute still remained on, modern labor movement begins. Settled, another committee was to be formed of one man from each of the nearest 2 district assemblies and a third from the district involved. If this committee failed to arbitrate the matter, the entire dispute could be referred to the executive board, the Grand Master Workman, and the Grand Secretary, whose decision would be final. No strike, the General Assembly ruled, undertaken without the sanction and orders of this joint body of General Assembly officers, shall be supported from the strike fund of this order. 31. The leadership of the Knights hoped that this provision, by making it almost impossible to render financial aid to strikes, would turn the thoughts of the membership to cooperative projects and arbitration. But the members knew that without the use of the strike their efforts to improve their conditions would be fruitless. When Uriah S. Stevens, the chief defender of secrecy, resigned his position of Grand Master Workman in September 1879, it was not long before the order became a public organization. The Grand Master Workman and the Grand Secretary were authorized by the Convention of 1881 to issue a proclamation on January L. 1882, to the workingmen of America informing them of the existence and objectives of the order. The convention also deleted the oath from the initiation pledge, substituting for it a simple promise, and voted to remove all spiritual passages and language from the ritual. 32. Powderly did not bother to issue the proclamation because he said everyone knew of the existence and objectives of the order. The real growth of the order dates from the Detroit Convention of 1881, where the secrecy of the organization was revoked with the secret ritual, however, continuing in practice. In 1878 the order had 9,287 members, in 1879, 20,151, in 1880, 28,136, and in 1883, 51,914. Its period of greatest growth was during 1885 to 86 when more than 600,000 joined. In 1878 Stevens had been nominated by the Greenback Labor Party for Congress in the 5th District of Pennsylvania. He resigned as Grand Master Workman of the Knights of Labor to devote his time to the campaign. After his defeat in the election, he was re-elected but resigned his position in 1879, explaining that Business and finance together render it impossible for me to be at Chicago. I do not feel that I can any longer bear the burden. It must rest upon other shoulders. Proceedings of the General Assembly of the K. of L. 1879, Powderly, 30. Years of Labor, page 629. In May 1880 there were 38 district assemblies, 7 of which were not Funk. Tioning, and 868 local assemblies in the Knights of Labor. The district assemblies were distributed as follows: Pennsylvania, 8, New Jersey, LJ, West Virginia, 4, Ohio, 3, Illinois, 4, Indiana, 1, New York, LJ, Missouri, L, Kentucky, 2, Maryland, I, Iowa, L, Alabama, 2, Massachusetts, R, Colorado, L. The following were the local assemblies: Alabama, 19, California, 2, Connecticut, 2, Colorado, 17, Delaware, 5, Georgia, L, Illinois, 58, Indian Territory, L, Indiana, 23, Iowa, 13, Kansas, 15, Kentucky, 36, Minnesota, 2, Massachusetts, N. 510. Labor movement in the United States. In February 1883, Robert D. Layton, testifying before a Senate committee investigating relations between labor and capital, stated that the membership of the order was in West Virginia, Illinois, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, California, and Canada. Any person over 18 years of age, he said, working for wages or who at any time worked for wages, could become a member. However, no person who either sells or makes his living by the sale of intoxicating drink can be admitted, and no lawyer, doctor, or banker can be admitted. Did this mean, he was asked, that manufacturers could become members? Yes, he replied. Manufacturers can belong to it. But local assemblies were to be composed of not less than 10 members, at least 3/4 of whom must be wage workers. 33 With the leaders of the Knights of Labor proclaiming the identity of interest between labor and capital, it is hardly surprising that employers were eligible for membership. One reason the Knights of Labor succeeded in organizing assemblies where unions had failed was because there were not enough workers engaged in one trade to support a union, while any number of trades could be represented in the mixed assemblies of the Knights of Labor. In many communities, partycub.rly in the rural districts, local assemblies AR1, IC, in which there were almost as many occupational issues represented as there were members. The mixed assembly was well suited for the organization of the semi-skilled, the unskilled, and the day laborers. It was to these workers that the Knights of Labor began to make its main appeal in the 80s because the trade unions had failed to organize them. The great slogan of the order, "An injury to one is the concern of all," was to arouse thousands of workers all over the country. 34 On August 15, 1880, the Journal of United Labor pointed with pride to the fact that many assemblies had Negro members who, for fidelity to their obligations, strict attendance on all meetings, prompt payment of dues, good conduct, and all that goes to make good members and good citizens, are not excelled by any other class of men in the order. As this development, it declared, was in keeping with the basic principles. Maryland, 18, Missouri, 35, Michigan, 2, New York, 23, New Jersey, 56, Ohio, 5R, Ontario, L, Oregon, 12, Pennsylvania, 396, Wyoming Territory, L, West Virginia, 67, Wisconsin, 1. Journal of United Labor, May 15, 1880. One great difficulty experienced by all single trade unions has been the organization of isolated workers in localities where the number of those employed at such a trade was not sufficient to form a local body of their own. Under the Knights of Labor, this difficulty is obviated, as they can join a mixed local assembly, which will enable any trade to thoroughly organize under one head. Journal of United Labor, July, 1883, page 520. T. John W. Hayes, General Secretary of the Order, estimated that in our 886 there were no less than 60,000 Negroes in the Knights of Labor. Sterling D. Spiro and Abram L. Harris, The Black Worker, the Negro and the Labor Movement, New York, 1931, page 42. Modern labor movement begins. Of the Knights of Labor as set forth in a decision of the Grand Master Workman in September 1879, which announced, "The outside color of a candidate sh.il not debar him from admission, rather let the coloring of his mind and heart be the test. We should be false to every principle of our order." The journal concluded, "Should we exclude from membership any man who gains his living by honest toil on account of his color or creed? Our platform is broad enough to take in all." Although the Knights believed that industrial development had passed beyond the craftsman stage upon which the trade unions were founded, 35 the order recognized that the skilled workers had special problems, and for some time tried to solve them. The first official expression of the Knights toward trade unions was made by Grand Master Workman Stevens before the Second Regular General Assembly in January 1879. He urged the issuing of an address to the trade associations of the continent, pointing out the weakness and evils of isolated effort or association, and the useless and crushing competition resulting therefrom, unproductive of good to themselves and the public at large. He suggested that the trade unions be reminded of the benefits of amalgamation and affiliation with our great brotherhood, and that a special effort be made toward unifying all labor organizations into one grand consolidated body. 88. A resolution was adopted providing that trades organized as trades may select an executive officer of their own, who may have charge of their organization, and organize local assemblies of the trade in any part of the country, and attach them to the district assembly controlling said trade. 37. These district assemblies were virtually national trade unions and would have their own officers and hold their own trade conventions. But at the next convention, in September 1879, an opposite policy was expressed toward trade unions. The General Assembly heard the leader of the order say, "No time should be lost or money spent in strikes or in the organization of separate trades or callings. Benefits resulting therefrom are but partial and evanescent. Our first duty is the consolidation of all branches of productive labor into a compact whole." There were 2 resolutions adopted on the Powderly used the experience of the Depression years as an argument against the craft unions. The panic, he maintained, had proved that the distinction between skilled and unskilled workers was fictitious, for the skilled craftsman had seen that he was no better than the man with the pick and shovel, insofar as securing employment at decent conditions was concerned. All men who labor, he therefore concluded, have been brought by the hard times to one level, and snood have the good sense to remain on that level. Most of the trades unions have gone to the wall. What is the lesson taught? We want no trade unions. Journal of United L. Aber, June 15, 1880. 512. Labor movement in the United States. Question of trade unions. One stated that the establishment of locals formed and conducted exclusively in the interest of any one trade is contrary to the spirit and genius of the order as founded, and we recommend that locals should admit workmen of all trades, and also that all laws permitting such exclusive organizations be rescinded. The other resolution asserted that locals, conducted in the interest of any special trade, must in all cases be subordinate to the district assembly in whose territory they may be located, and all laws permitting trade district assemblies to interfere with the control of the other district assemblies over any local assembly in their district are rescinded. 38. In 1882, the General Assembly returned to its original policy in regard to trade unions. Trade locals were now encouraged. The Journal of United Labor went out of its way to prove that the formation of trade locals in districts is and always has been from the first a part of the plan of the Knights of Labor. 39. The window glass workers organized a powerful national assembly at a time when even trade locals were prohibited by the laws of the order, and it was given the right to organize as a national trade union under the designation of Local Assembly No. 300. The Knights now encouraged this trend, assuring the trade unions that they could protect the interests of their trade just the same, and at the same time receive all the advantages of organization and association with all other branches of industry. 40. Undoubtedly, the discontent with the existing mixed district assemblies was instrumental in creating a more friendly attitude in the Knights of Labor toward the trade unions. One important factor in this change of mind was the emergence in 1881 of a rival organization, the Federation of Organized Trades and Labor Unions of the United States and Canada, the foundation stone of the American Federation of Labor. The new unionism of the 1870s. To understand the forces that created the Federation, it is necessary to go back to the terrible years after the Panic of 1873 and examine the activity of a small group of cigar makers who were building the model for the new unionism in the crafts. These